I never believed in ghost stories until I moved into the small, two-room apartment on Elm Street. At first, it was exactly what I'd hoped for, a quiet, affordable place with character, nestled in an old building that had seen better days. The landlord had assured me nothing was wrong, and for the first few weeks, everything was normal. That was, until I began noticing small, inexplicable changes that I couldn't quite dismiss. It started with little things. One morning, I left my car keys on the kitchen table as usual, only to find them missing when I returned from a quick errand. I searched the entire apartment and finally discovered them lying on the windowsill, as if someone had placed them there after I left. I told myself I must have absent-mindedly moved them, but deep down, I felt a chill that I couldn't explain. Then, I began to notice that items didn't always remain where I left them. A book I'd been reading was once on my coffee table, and the next day was on the arm of my sofa. A lamp that I always turn off at night was inexplicably on when I woke up one morning. At first, I assumed it was my own forgetfulness, but the frequency of these events grew too high to be simple oversight. One evening, after a long day at work, I settled in a bed only to hear a soft scratching sound near my closet. I lay there in the dark, heart pounding, convinced it was an animal or perhaps a branch scraping against the window. When I finally mustered the courage to get up, I found no sign of an intruder. Yet, on the inside of my closet door, faint marks were etched, scratches that didn't match the old, worn look of the wood. I couldn't recall ever noticing them before. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that the marks must have been there all along, but a nagging sense of dread began to creep in. As days turned into weeks, the changes escalated. I started finding strange, unfamiliar symbols drawn in what looked like charcoal on the backs of doors and under the stairwell. They weren't menacing exactly, but they carried a weight that made my skin crawl. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I had heard soft voices or footsteps echoing in the hallways. Yet when I'd check, there was nothing, only silence and the oppressive darkness of my own thoughts. I asked a neighbor about it, someone I'd grown friendly with, but she merely smiled politely and said she hadn't noticed anything unusual. When I mentioned the moved objects, she insisted I must be tired or imagining things. The real turning point came one rainy afternoon when I returned from work. I had been gone for only a few hours, yet as I stepped into my apartment, a palpable feeling of wrongness greeted me. The living room looked identical to how I'd left it, except for one detail. My favorite framed photograph of my family had been turned face down on the coffee table. I picked it up slowly, half expecting to see someone's fingerprints on the back, but there were none, only a thin layer of dust, as if it had been undisturbed for weeks. The realization hit me hard. Things were not merely moving. They were being rearranged, altered in subtle ways that I could neither control nor explain. Desperate for answers, I began documenting every occurrence in a notebook, meticulously recording the time, date, and specific changes I observed. I photographed every room, every item, but when I compared the images from one day to the next, discrepancies emerged. A cushion slightly shifted, a vase with a small crack that wasn't there before, a clock that seemed to have reset to an earlier time. I even started noticing that my own memories felt unreliable. I recalled having conversations that, when recounted later, differed in details I swore were fixed. I began to suspect that the apartment was not only changing physically, but that something deeper was altering my perception of reality. One night, after a particularly unsettling day of inexplicable events, I decided to leave the apartment early. As I locked the door behind me, I caught a glimpse of a figure in the reflection of the glass. Someone standing just outside the hallway watching. I spun around, but there was no one there. The encounter left me trembling, and I realized that these changes might be part of a larger, unexplainable picture that extended beyond mere rearrangements of furniture. I reached out to a friend, hoping that sharing my experience might ground me in reality. But when I described the events, the moving objects, the strange symbols, the altered memories, he only gave me a pitying look and suggested that I was under too much stress, that my imagination was playing tricks on me. Even the landlord, when confronted, dismissed my concerns as the ramblings of a nervous tenant. I felt increasingly isolated, trapped in an environment where every familiar detail had become suspect. Now, as I sit alone in my dimly lit apartment, I can't shake the feeling that I'm living inside a closed loop or an alternate reality. Each day, the world around me changes imperceptibly until the familiar becomes foreign, and I'm left questioning whether any of it is real. The more I try to piece together the pattern, the more I'm confronted by a lurking, intangible presence, something that seems to orchestrate these shifts in my environment. I don't know if it's a supernatural force, a glitch in reality, or simply a product of my own unraveling mind. But one thing is certain: the phenomenon is too consistent, too deliberate to be mere coincidence. With every rearranged object, every mysterious mark, and every altered memory, I feel myself drawn deeper into a puzzle I cannot solve. I've reached a point where I no longer trust my own senses, and the safe, static reality I once knew has been replaced by an ever-shifting maze of uncertainty. I'm left with a lingering, unsettling question. Is my perception of reality just a fragile illusion? Or is something far more disturbing at work, meticulously rewriting my existence? I can't tell if I'm merely experiencing a series of inexplicable events or if I've become part of a larger, orchestrated anomaly. And as I stare at the silent, ever-changing walls of my apartment, I can't help but wonder, was it all in my head, or is there something out there patiently waiting to reveal the true nature of our reality? I never believed that some nights could unravel the fabric of reality, but the events that transpired at my grandmother's isolated farmhouse defied every rational explanation. I had inherited the creaking, centuries-old house, not out of affection, but as a final tether to a past I scarcely understood. My first night, there was unsettling in its ordinariness. The distant hoot of an owl, the soft rustling of leaves against broken window panes, but nothing more. It was on the second night that the quiet was disturbed by a series of soft knocks on the ancient wooden door. At first, I assumed it was the wind dancing through the eaves, but as the knocks grew more deliberate and insistent, an inexplicable dread began to seep into my bones. I opened the door to a darkness that swallowed the weak beam of my flashlight. The silence that followed was thick, as if the night itself was holding its breath. In the days that followed, small anomalies escalated into something far more disturbing. Objects in the house moved on their own, and disembodied whispers echoed in empty corridors. I began to document every occurrence in a journal, hoping that a rational explanation would emerge from the patterns. Yet, with each entry, I found myself descending deeper into a labyrinth of inexplicable events. On a particularly stormy evening, while poring over the journal, I discovered names and dates scribbled in a shaky hand, a record of previous occupants who had vanished without trace. The entries hinted at a presence, an entity that lurked behind the veneer of normalcy, patiently waiting for a moment to claim its next victim. One night, as I attempted to sleep despite the pervasive tension, I awoke to the sensation of being watched. I sat up, heart hammering, to see a pale figure standing at the foot of my bed. Its eyes were voids, and it emitted a low, mournful hum that vibrated through the very air. Frozen in terror, I could only watch as the figure raised a hand, pointing toward the attic. I knew the attic was forbidden, a place of locked memories and concealed secrets. With trembling resolve, I crept up the narrow staircase. The attic was cluttered with relics of a bygone era, dusty portraits, tarnished silverware, and a faded diary that lay open on an antique desk. As I leafed through the diary, the words seemed to rearrange themselves, recounting a tale of sorrow and betrayal that echoed my own suppressed grief. It was then that I realized the presence wasn't confined to spectral images or restless memories. It was intertwined with the very essence of the house. Days turned into weeks as I delved deeper into the history of the farmhouse. I learned that the estate had been the epicenter of inexplicable tragedies for generations. Neighbors whispered about ghostly apparitions and mournful cries that resonated through the night, though few dared to speak of the entity that roamed its halls. One evening, a violent thunderstorm rattled the windows as I uncovered an old, handwritten letter tucked behind a loose brick in the parlor. The letter spoke of a ritual gone awry and a spirit condemned to wander, forever bound by a pact made in despair. With each new revelation, the house grew colder, and the line between the living and the dead blurred until I could no longer tell if the flickering shadows were tricks of the light or harbingers of something far more sinister. I began to fear the night, for when darkness fell, the presence would stir. Footsteps echoed along corridors that had been silent for decades, and whispers, indistinct yet accusatory, filled the air. I found myself drawn to the front door as if compelled by an unseen force, only to retreat at the last moment. The nights became a relentless cycle of dread and uneasy curiosity. I installed a small recorder in the hallway, determined to capture any evidence of the paranormal. One morning, I awoke to find the recorder on, its playback filled with fragmented voices that recounted names and dates, a morbid litany of those who had suffered the house's curse. The final words, barely audible, were a desperate plea. Remember us. Now, as I write these words in a trembling haze of insomnia and uncertainty, I remain haunted by that night. The entity's presence lingers in every creak of the floorboard and every gust of frigid wind that escapes through a cracked window. My attempts to contact experts have been met with skeptical glances and hollow assurances, leaving me isolated with a truth too terrifying to share openly. Each evening, as I prepare for sleep, I feel that unseen weight upon my chest, a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. I live with the constant knowledge that the past is not dead, and that in the quiet moments between heartbeats, something watches from the shadows. Even now, as I recount this ordeal, a chill runs down my spine, a silent, persistent warning that the mystery is far from solved, and the echoes of that dreadful night continue to whisper in the dark corners of my mind, inviting me to remember what should have been forgotten. I cannot escape the feeling that I am merely a keeper of a terrible secret, destined to wander in a maze of unanswered questions. Every creak in the night and every unexplained whisper serves as a reminder that the boundary between our world and the unknown is perilously thin. I have tried to move on, to lock away the memories in the recesses of my mind, yet they persist, a relentless chorus of lost souls. The farmhouse stands as a monument to tragedies long past, its walls echoing with silent laments and the weight of countless untold stories. I urge you, if you ever encounter a place that feels too heavy with sorrow, to heed the warning of my experience. Some mysteries, once uncovered, leave a mark that time cannot erase, and the presence of what lies beyond may forever alter the course of your own existence. The first thing I noticed was the picture frame. It sat on my living room shelf like it always had, a photo of me and my parents from a trip years ago. But one morning, as I passed by with my coffee, something about it made me stop. My mother's dress was wrong. I distinctly remembered that bright red floral dress because she had bought it specifically for that trip. But in the photo, she was wearing a muted blue sweater. I frowned, convincing myself I had misremembered. Maybe I was thinking of another trip, another photo, but when I looked closer, I noticed something even more unsettling: her expression. It was off, a little too blank, her eyes unfocused, as if she had been caught mid-blink. My father, too. The whole picture seemed subtly different, as if it were the same memory, but slightly warped. I pushed the thought away and went to work. The day passed uneventfully, but that night, as I settled onto my couch, my eyes drifted back to the frame. My stomach clenched. Now the background had changed. The trees behind us had been thick with leaves in the original picture, the warm greens of late summer. But now, they were bare, skeletal branches reaching into a gray sky. I pulled the frame off the shelf, my hands trembling. I knew that picture. I knew it, and this wasn't it. I called my mom. "Hey," I said, forcing a laugh. "You remember that trip to the mountains? The one where you wore that red dress?" She hesitated. "Red dress? Honey, I don't think I had a red dress back then." I felt my breath hitch. "No, you did. I remember because you said you bought it just for the trip. "I think you're mixing things up," she said lightly, but something in her voice sounded distant, distracted. "I always wore that blue sweater on that trip. Are you feeling okay?" I muttered a weak response and hung up, staring at the photo in my hands. The next day, other things began to shift. The coffee shop I always went to had its furniture arranged differently, though no one else seemed to notice. The barista, who had been working there for years, no longer recognized me, even though I had seen her every morning for the past 6 months. The usual neighborhood dog, a friendly golden retriever that always barked happily when I passed, now just stared at me silently, its tail still. I tried telling my best friend, Lauren, about it over dinner. "You ever feel like things just change, but only you notice?" She frowned. "Like what?" I hesitated. "Like things in your house looking slightly different, or people not remembering things the way you do." Lauren tilted her head. "That's just normal memory stuff. Your brain fills in the blanks." "No," I said, shaking my head. "It's not just that. It's like reality itself is shifting." She gave me a sympathetic smile. "You're probably just stressed." I wanted to argue, but her expression was calm, unwavering, like nothing was wrong. Like I was the only one seeing it. That night, I barely slept. I kept checking the picture frame, watching for any further changes. Around 2 a.m., I swore I heard faint whispering. It was so quiet, just a breath of sound, but it sent a chill down my spine. I turned on every light in my apartment, searching for a source. Nothing. By morning, I felt exhausted, paranoid. When I stepped outside, my heart dropped. The house across the street had changed. It was still in the same place, still had the same layout, but the color was wrong. It had always been a soft yellow, but now it was dark blue. I stood frozen, staring, while people walked past me like nothing was amiss. A woman I recognized, a neighbor I had chatted with a dozen times, caught my eye. I forced myself to speak. "Hey, do you know when they repainted that house?" She blinked at me. "It's always been that color." "No, it hasn't." My voice wavered. "It was yellow yesterday." She let out an awkward laugh, glancing around like she wanted to get away from me. "I think you're confused." I stood there, watching as she hurried down the street. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I needed proof. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through old photos. There had to be one with that house in the background, but every single picture showed it as blue. I felt sick. The changes kept happening. Every day, something new was wrong. The names of stores I had known for years were suddenly different. Street signs bore names I had never seen before. And the worst part? People in my life started changing too. Lauren stopped answering my texts. When I finally called her, she sounded distant, formal, like she barely remembered me. "Sorry, I've been busy," she said vaguely. "Work's been crazy." But she didn't work. She had quit months ago. I had been there when she cleared out her desk. I laughed nervously. "Lauren, you don't have a job." A long silence. Then, in a voice that wasn't hers, she said, "Are you sure?" The call disconnected. I sat in my silent apartment, staring at my phone, my hands ice cold. I couldn't trust anything anymore. Not my memories, not my surroundings, not the people around me. Every time I tried to talk about it, I was met with the same responses. "You're confused. You're stressed. You're remembering things wrong." I started taking pictures of everything. My apartment, my street, the store signs. Every night, I checked them, comparing them to what was outside my window. And every night, something was different. One evening, I locked my doors, turned off my phone, and sat in the middle of my room, waiting. Just waiting. If something was watching me, if something was changing things, I wanted to catch it in the act. Sometime around 3 a.m., I must have dozed off. I woke up to silence. My room looked the same. The clock on my nightstand still ticked steadily. But my phone was missing. I searched the entire apartment, every drawer, every surface. It was gone. When I went outside to check, I froze. The house across the street was yellow again. I stood there, breathing heavily, feeling something unravel inside me. Something was wrong. Something was playing with me. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't crazy, but no one else saw it. No one else noticed. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. I don't know if it's just my neighborhood or the entire world that's shifting. But I do know one thing. Whatever is changing my reality doesn't want me to fight it. And I think that's why, when I got home that night, my phone was sitting neatly on my kitchen counter, screen cracked, with a single message displayed. Stop looking. I moved into my new apartment on a cool October evening, excited for a fresh start in a place I could call my own. The building was old but charming, with creaking floors and a certain character that I'd grown to love. On my first day, everything was as expected. Boxes unpacked, furniture arranged just so, and a quiet calm that made me feel safe. But as the days passed, I began noticing small changes that I couldn't quite explain. It started with the living room. I distinctly remembered placing my favorite ceramic mug, a chipped blue piece I'd found at a flea market, on the coffee table right by the window. One evening, after a long day at work, I came home and found the mug exactly where I left it. Relieved, I sat down to relax. But a few hours later, while reaching for the remote, I noticed the mug had inexplicably shifted to the center of the table. I frowned, certain I hadn't moved it, yet it sat there, as if deliberately placed in a new position. I chalked it up to a trick of the light or my own forgetfulness. The next anomaly was even subtler. While unpacking a few more boxes, I discovered a handwritten note tucked inside one of the drawers in my bedroom. It read simply, "Remember." The handwriting wasn't mine, and I had no idea when or how it had appeared. I asked a couple of neighbors if they'd seen anything unusual, but they all insisted nothing had changed in the building lately. I began to wonder if I was just imagining things. Over the following week, the changes grew more persistent. Returning from work one evening, I noticed that the arrangement of my furniture seemed slightly off. The bookshelf, which I had placed against the north wall, was now leaning against the east wall. I distinctly recalled moving it there weeks ago and then dragging it back, but I was sure I had left it untouched for days. My heart pounded as I inspected every room, only to find small discrepancies. A cushion moved from its usual spot on the sofa. A painting rotated a few degrees from where I had hung it. Then came the strangest occurrence. One morning, as I sipped coffee at my kitchen table, I glanced at the clock on the wall. It read 8:13. I remembered leaving it at exactly 8:13 the day before, yet I was sure I had done nothing different. Over the next several days, the clock would show the same time each time I returned home, as if I were stuck in a moment that repeated itself. At first, it was only the clock. Then, I began noticing that everyday routines and objects seemed to be locked in a loop. I'd leave my apartment in the morning, and when I returned, a new book would appear on my coffee table. A book I had never seen before, but that I knew I had left there just yesterday. I started keeping a meticulous journal, documenting every minor change in hopes of finding a rational explanation. I photographed the living room, the kitchen, every nook and cranny of my apartment. Yet each day, when I compared the photos, there were discrepancies. A vase that had been on a shelf was now on the floor. The pattern on a rug looked slightly different. Even the view from my window showed a tree with one fewer branch. I questioned my memory, but deep down, I knew I hadn't rearranged anything. One night, unable to sleep from mounting anxiety, I sat in my darkened living room and listened to the silence. Every so often, I thought I heard a faint rustling, as if someone were moving about the apartment. When I got up to check, everything was in its place, only slightly altered, as though someone had been there and then vanished without a trace. I began to feel like a spectator in my own life, trapped in a world where the familiar was slowly turning alien. The tipping point came when I found an envelope on my doormat. Inside was a single photograph of my living room, taken from an angle I never used. In the picture, the bookshelf was on the east wall, the same as the day I returned from work last week. On the back of the photograph was written in neat, deliberate handwriting, "Change is inevitable." I trembled as I realized that these weren't random coincidences. They were part of a pattern, a loop of subtle alterations that I had no control over. I tried reaching out to friends, even the friendly neighbor who had welcomed me on move-in day, but no one else seemed to notice anything amiss. Their apartments were static, their memories unchanged. I began to fear that I was losing my mind, that I was the only one experiencing this slow, creeping distortion of reality. Now, as I sit in the dim light of my living room, I can no longer trust the solidity of the world around me. Every object, every detail, seems capable of shifting when I'm not looking. I've become hyper-aware of every minute movement. A creak in the floorboards, a slight change in the angle of a picture frame, and each time, a chill of dread runs through me. I fear that I've stumbled into some kind of closed loop or alternate reality, where my every return home reveals a subtly different world than the one I left behind. I no longer know if these changes are the result of my own failing memory, a trick of light and shadow, or something far more sinister, a reality that is rewriting itself in front of my very eyes. The more I try to cling to the life I once knew, the more it slips away, replaced by a shifting, unrecognizable landscape that seems determined to erase the past. And as I confront this unsettling truth, I'm left with a horrifying question. Have I become trapped in a glitch, a permanent loop of inexplicable change, from which there may be no escape? The answer, I fear, may be that reality itself is nothing more than an illusion, and that I am forever doomed to wander a house that is no longer my home, a life that is constantly in flux. I first noticed him on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while waiting for my coffee at the Corner Brew, a small, unassuming cafe tucked away in a quiet part of town. I had always enjoyed the subtle hum of conversation and the occasional clink of ceramic cups. That day, though, something was different. As I sipped my latte and scrolled through my phone, I caught a glimpse of a man sitting at a table near the window. He seemed absorbed in a book, but every so often, his eyes would wander in my direction as if he were studying me. I dismissed it as mere coincidence, a curious glance from a stranger lost in thought. Little did I know that this fleeting encounter would be the beginning of something far more unsettling. Over the next few days, I started to notice him again and again. One morning, on my routine walk to the bus stop, I saw him leaning casually against a lamppost on the opposite side of the street, watching me. At first, I rationalized that our paths simply crossed in this small neighborhood. But as the days passed, the pattern became too consistent to ignore. He was always there at the periphery of my vision, at the grocery store when I picked up my weekly supplies, at the park during my evening jog, and even near my workplace as I hurried along the sidewalk. Each time, he seemed to be quietly observing, his expression unreadable and calm. I began to feel an unsettling prickle of anxiety, a sensation that someone was tracking my every move. Then came the moments that truly unsettled me. It started with a small, almost imperceptible shift in his behavior. At the Corner Brew, he began approaching me during moments when I thought I was alone. He would initiate polite conversation, asking about the weather or commenting on the coffee, always with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His tone was pleasant, but there was an undercurrent of something more, an intensity that made my skin crawl. One day, after our brief exchange, I found a folded receipt on my table, the same receipt from the cafe, with a note scribbled in the corner. "I see you." A chill ran down my spine, and I hastily left, my heart pounding as I tried to make sense of the message. As the days turned into weeks, his presence became increasingly invasive. I began noticing small traces of his involvement in my day-to-day life. Once, after returning home from work, I discovered my front door, which I was sure I had locked, slightly ajar. Inside, a single black glove lay on the floor, a glove I did not recognize. On another occasion, I found my car inexplicably parked in an odd spot, as if someone had tampered with its alignment, though nothing appeared damaged. Each unexplained occurrence piled on top of the last, leaving me with a growing sense of dread. I started questioning my own sanity. Was I truly being followed, or was my mind conjuring these signs out of isolation and fear? I tried to alert my friends about the strange man, but their reactions were mixed. Some dismissed my concerns as paranoia, a result of too many late nights and too much caffeine, while others offered sympathetic nods without taking any real action. The man's behavior was always subtle enough to be shrugged off as eccentricity, a friendly face in a sea of strangers. Yet every time I encountered him, the feeling of being watched deepened, wrapping around me like an invisible shroud. I altered my routines, avoided the usual routes, and even contemplated moving to a new neighborhood. But no matter where I went, I could sense his presence lingering at the edge of my vision. Days then turned into a relentless cycle of anxiety. Each morning, as I embarked on my daily routine, I felt the weight of his unseen gaze following me, even when I couldn't physically see him. I started taking different routes, alternating between busy streets and quiet lanes. Yet every time I reached what should have been a safe space, I caught a glimpse of him, standing on a corner, peering from behind a tree, or reflected in a passing car's window. His presence was like a persistent echo, a reminder that I might not be alone in my own life. I questioned every shadow, every passerby, unable to distinguish between genuine threat and the specter of my own paranoia. At work, the atmosphere grew tense. I found myself distracted by the nagging thought that my movements were being observed. During breaks, I would scan the room, half expecting to see him sitting silently among my colleagues. When I mentioned the incident at the cafe to a coworker, they smiled politely and quickly changed the subject, leaving me to wonder if they too had sensed something off. My concentration waned, and even routine tasks felt burdened by the constant sensation of an invisible observer. Desperation finally drove me to confront the situation head-on. One rainy evening, I parked my car near the cafe, hoping to capture evidence of his presence. I sat in the dim lot as rain drizzled down, the minutes stretching interminably. At first, nothing happened. Then, just as I was about to leave, I saw him across the street under a flickering neon sign. I kept my eyes fixed on him, my pulse racing so loudly I was sure he could hear it. In that tense moment, he met my gaze, his eyes glinting with a curious mixture of determination and something unspoken. He mouthed a few words I couldn't decipher, and that brief encounter sent me racing back to my apartment, the echo of his silent message reverberating in my mind. Since then, I have taken every precaution, altering my schedule, varying my routes, and even upgrading my home security. Yet every measure seems only to confirm my worst fears, that he is adapting, always managing to appear no matter how I try to hide. Even recordings from my phone's camera capture nothing more than fleeting shadows and blurred reflections. My journal is filled with meticulous notes about every encounter and every inexplicable occurrence, but the entries only serve to deepen my sense of isolation and helplessness. Now, as I sit alone in my dimly lit apartment with the rain tapping on my window, I am left with a lingering, unnerving uncertainty. Am I simply caught in a series of eerie coincidences? Or have I unwittingly become the target of someone whose intentions remain as murky as the night? The question gnaws at me with every passing day. Is this merely a twist of fate, or is someone truly stalking me, meticulously orchestrating these encounters? I moved into my new apartment on a crisp October day, excited for a fresh start in a place that felt safe and unassuming. The building was old, with a charming creak to its floors and warm sunlight spilling through the windows in the morning. My first few days were as normal as you could hope: a quiet space, friendly neighbors, and a routine that promised stability. Then, one evening, I noticed something that I initially dismissed as a trick of my tired mind. A small, handwritten note lying on my kitchen counter that simply read, "Remember." I never received any explanation for it, and when I asked my neighbor, Ms. Peterson, an elderly lady known for her kind smiles, she only patted my hand and said, "Oh, you'll remember soon enough." I thought nothing more of it, attributing it to a misplaced act of kindness. But soon the strange occurrences began to multiply. I'd leave my apartment in the morning, and upon returning, I'd find that everyday items had inexplicably shifted positions. My favorite book, which I distinctly remembered being on the coffee table, would be on the dining table instead. The curtains, which I had drawn just before I left, were found open, letting in a chill that wasn't there before. I started keeping a careful mental note of these changes, but every time I mentioned them to friends or the building manager, I was met with shrugged indifference. "You must be imagining things," they'd say. Yet, deep down, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was very wrong. One afternoon, I was walking down the hall when I saw a man I didn't recognize. He stood at the end of the corridor, watching silently. I blinked, and he was gone, as if swallowed by the shadows. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a resident I hadn't met yet, but the unnerving sensation lingered. Then, one rainy night, I returned home late from work. The apartment door was slightly ajar, even though I was certain I had locked it. Inside, the lights were dimmer, and the familiar layout of my living room seemed altered in subtle ways. A cushion that had always been on the left side of the sofa was now on the right, and a painting I'd admired for years hung crookedly on the wall. I felt as though I were stepping into a place I knew intimately. Yet something essential had changed. Over the following weeks, the incidents escalated. I began noticing that conversations with people around me, friends, co-workers, even Ms. Peterson, were laced with peculiar gaps. One day, during a casual chat, a friend insisted that I had confided a deeply personal secret to her weeks ago, something I knew I had never mentioned. At work, my supervisor complimented me on a decision I couldn't recall ever making, and my colleagues exchanged knowing glances when I tried to recount my version of events. I started to suspect that my own memories were being edited, that moments were being removed or altered without my consent. Late one night, as I sat in the silence of my apartment, I heard the sound of soft footsteps outside my door. I pressed my ear to the cool wood and listened intently, but all I could hear was the rhythmic patter of rain against the window and a whisper of a voice that I couldn't quite decipher. My heart raced as I realized that the danger I felt wasn't coming from any external threat. It was seeping from within, as if my own environment was conspiring against me. I became convinced that my actions, my memories, even the very space around me were being manipulated by an unseen force. Desperate for answers, I began documenting every odd occurrence. I took photographs of the shifted furniture, recorded my phone's timestamps, and kept a journal detailing each moment that felt off. Yet, the more I recorded, the more I found that even these records were inconsistent. Photos would show slight differences when compared side by side, and my journal entries sometimes contradicted each other, as though I had written them in two different timelines. I reached out to a couple of close friends, hoping they'd notice something I had missed, but they all insisted that nothing was out of the ordinary. Their dismissals left me isolated with my growing dread. One evening, I came home to find a photograph pinned to my door. It was a snapshot of my own living room, taken from an angle I did not recognize. In the bottom corner, written in delicate script, were the words, "It's time." I dropped the photo, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I stared at it in disbelief. Who was watching? And why was my life being rearranged as if it were a set piece in some twisted performance? Now, as I sit in the dim light of my apartment, every creak of the floorboard and every whisper of the wind fills me with a deep-seated terror. The familiar has become foreign, and I am haunted by the possibility that I am not living life on my own terms, that someone or something is pulling the strings, erasing parts of my past and altering my present. I feel like I'm trapped in a closed loop, an alternate reality where the only constant is the relentless, inexplicable change. I no longer know if the discrepancies are mere coincidences or if they are deliberate acts by an unseen force determined to rewrite my existence. I have no clear answers, only the bitter knowledge that my life is being reshaped by something dark and unfathomable. The more I try to hold on to the reality I once knew, the more it slips away, leaving behind only a cold, lingering fear that I am being controlled from the outside. And so, I am left to wonder in sleepless nights and frantic moments of paranoia. Is it just my mind playing tricks on me, or is there something far more sinister at work? A force that will never allow me to reclaim the life I once understood? I fear that I may be destined to live in this ever-shifting nightmare, forever at the mercy of an inexplicable power that sees me not as a person, but as a pawn in a darker, unsolvable game. It all started with a knock at my door. I had just moved into a new apartment, a small one-bedroom place in an older building on the quieter side of town. The rent was suspiciously cheap, but the landlord assured me that was only because the place had been sitting empty for a while. I didn't question it. I was just relieved to finally have a place of my own. The knock came late in the evening, just as I was settling in. I opened the door to find a woman standing there, probably in her mid-40s, with short, dark hair and an overly enthusiastic smile. "Welcome to the building," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Helen. I live in 4B, right across the hall." Her friendliness was a little forced, but I didn't think much of it. She asked the usual questions: where I was from, what I did for work, and told me that most of the other tenants were quiet, keeping to themselves. I found that reassuring. After a few minutes, she handed me a plate of cookies wrapped in plastic. "Just a little welcome gift," she said. "I hope you like them." I thanked her, and she gave me one last lingering smile before heading back to her apartment. It was a little odd how long she stared before closing her door, but I figured she was just being friendly. The next morning, I found the plate of cookies sitting on my kitchen counter, where I'd left them. I wasn't really in the mood for sweets, so I decided to take them to work. But when I unwrapped them at lunch, I noticed something strange. Each cookie had a single indentation in the center, as if someone had pressed their thumb into the dough before baking. I couldn't explain why, but the sight of it unsettled me. Maybe it was nothing, but the idea of eating them made my stomach turn. I ended up throwing them away. For the first week, everything seemed normal. Helen would smile at me in the hallway, but never linger too long. I rarely saw the other tenants. The building had an eerie stillness to it, but I chalked that up to thin walls and a lack of activity. Then, one night, something changed. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of whispering. It was faint, barely more than a murmur, but it was coming from the hallway outside my door. I lay still, straining to hear. It was a soft, rhythmic voice, Helen's. I recognized the slightly breathy way she spoke, but I couldn't make out what she was saying. After a few minutes, the whispering stopped, followed by the sound of her door clicking shut. The next morning, I ran into Helen on my way out. She greeted me with the same warm smile as always, but something felt off. "Did you sleep well?" she asked casually. I hesitated. "Yeah, I guess." I thought I heard something in the hallway, though. Her expression didn't change, but there was a slight flicker in her eyes, like she knew exactly what I was talking about. "Oh, these old buildings make all sorts of noises," she said lightly. "You'll get used to it." I nodded, but something about the way she brushed it off made my stomach twist. That night, I heard the whispering again. This time, I got up and crept toward the door, pressing my ear against the wood. It was definitely Helen's voice, but she wasn't alone. Another voice, lower and rougher, responded in hushed tones. I couldn't make out the words, but the rhythm of their exchange felt deliberate. Planned. I didn't sleep well after that. Over the next few days, I started noticing little things that I couldn't quite explain. My front door would be unlocked when I was sure I had locked it. A single chair in my kitchen had been pulled out when I knew I had pushed it in. A small, black smudge appeared on my bathroom mirror, almost like a fingerprint, but smudged and smeared. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe I had forgotten to lock the door. Maybe I had moved the chair without thinking. Maybe the smudge was just condensation. But I was lying to myself, and I knew it. The real breaking point came when I found something tucked under my doormat. A scrap of paper with a single word scrawled in shaky handwriting. Soon, my hands went cold as I stared at it. My mind raced with possibilities. Was someone in the building messing with me? Had Helen left it? And if so, why? I decided to install a cheap security camera in my apartment, just to ease my nerves. I placed it on a shelf facing the door, hoping to catch whoever might be sneaking in. That night, I barely slept, waiting to hear the whispering again. Nothing. Silence. The next morning, I checked the footage, my fingers trembling. The recording showed the empty apartment, motionless for hours. And then, around 3 a.m., the screen flickered. For just a few seconds, the image warped. When it cleared, something was different. The chair in my kitchen was pulled out. I replayed the footage over and over, but there was no sign of movement. No one entering or leaving. Just an empty room. And yet, the chair had moved. I packed my things that morning and left. I called the landlord and told him I wasn't staying another night. He barely seemed surprised, just sighed and said, "It happens." I don't know what he meant by that, and honestly, I never saw Helen again. I don't know what she wanted or what she was whispering about in the hallway at night. I don't know how my door kept unlocking, or why my furniture moved when no one was there. I don't know if someone had been watching me, waiting for something, I only know one thing. I was not supposed to be there, and I left just in time. I first noticed something was off on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning. I woke up to the sound of my alarm, went about my usual routine, and stepped into the kitchen to make coffee. As I reached for my favorite mug, I caught a glimpse of it on the counter, but something wasn't right. The mug was tilted at an odd angle, as if someone had nudged it overnight, even though I distinctly remembered placing it right side up before I went to bed. I brushed it off as a minor lapse in my memory and continued with my day. On my way out, I walked past the building's entrance and noticed a stranger leaning against the doorframe. His face was vaguely familiar, like someone I'd seen before, but he wasn't in my contacts or on any social media. I assumed it was a chance encounter, a neighbor perhaps, and nodded in greeting. Yet when I later tried to recall his features, they seemed to shift with each recollection, never quite settling into a concrete image. The day went on normally, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was subtly, inexplicably wrong. At work, the strangest glitch occurred. During my mid-morning break, I decided to visit the supply closet to get some extra pens. I distinctly remembered leaving a red box of markers on a shelf 2 days earlier. Yet when I opened the door, it was gone. In its place was a blue box of highlighters that I had never seen before. I checked my desk, my locker, and even questioned a coworker who had been there the previous day. Everyone insisted they'd seen the red markers, but there was no sign of them. I began to wonder if I was simply misremembering details, or if reality was somehow rearranging itself around me. The glitches continued throughout the day. At lunch, I sat in the same booth at our favorite diner where I'd eaten for the past year, but today the menu board had been replaced with one listing dishes I didn't recall ever offering. The waitress, someone I'd always joked had a sixth sense for knowing my order before I even spoke, now hesitated when I asked for my usual. "I'm sorry, I don't see that on today's menu," she said, her voice laced with a hint of uncertainty that I had never heard before. I left the diner with my appetite diminished and a nagging sense of disorientation. As the days passed, the inconsistencies began to blend into my everyday life. I started noticing that people I encountered on my daily commute would appear multiple times, as if stuck in a loop. I would wave to a man on the bus, only to see him later that same day on my street corner, looking at me with the same vacant expression. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but then I began to recognize the same clothes, the same posture, like a playback of a scene on repeat. The phenomenon wasn't alarming enough to send me into a panic, but it was enough to make me question whether my memory or my perception was reliable. One evening, I returned home after a long day and found my living room arranged in a slightly different configuration. The sofa, which I was sure had been in the center of the room for months, was now pushed against the wall, and a coffee table I'd never owned was in its place. I sat on the edge of the unfamiliar sofa, feeling a cold shiver down my spine. I tried to call a friend and describe what I was seeing, but they laughed it off, insisting I was mistaken. "That's not your apartment. That's exactly how it's always been," they said. Their words did little to dispel the growing unease inside me. I started keeping a journal, meticulously recording every detail of my day in an attempt to catch the glitches in action. I photographed the red markers that had inexplicably transformed into blue highlighters and the altered layout of my living room. Yet each time I reviewed the photos, they appeared perfectly normal, as if nothing had changed at all. It was like watching a movie on a loop, with subtle alterations that only I could sense. I felt increasingly isolated, trapped in a reality that was bending in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. The tipping point came one rainy afternoon when I was walking home from work. I passed a small park where I had spent many happy afternoons, only to find the familiar fountain replaced by a modern sculpture that seemed alien in the otherwise quaint setting. I stopped in my tracks and stared, heart pounding, as a woman I had known for years, my childhood friend Mia, approached me. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft and concerned. I tried to explain, but she only smiled, shook her head, and said, "You're just tired. Come on, let's get you home." In that moment, I realized that even the people closest to me were oblivious to the shifting layers of reality, their recollections stubbornly fixed to a version of the world that no longer matched my own. Now, As I sit in my apartment reviewing the entries in my journal, the lines between memory and illusion blur. I've begun to suspect that these glitches aren't random at all. They're deliberate. The more I notice, the more I feel like I'm becoming part of some larger, unfathomable experiment. I've seen faces repeat, objects reappear in different places, and the familiar turns subtly alien. It's as if the world is caught in a loop, and I'm the only one aware of the malfunction. I can no longer trust what I see. Every morning, I wake up wondering if I'll find a new inconsistency in the mirror, a different arrangement in my room, or a stranger who looks just like someone I already know. The comfort of normalcy has vanished, replaced by a persistent, nagging doubt that reality itself is glitching, flawed, unstable, and perhaps irreparably broken. I've grown accustomed to these disruptions, even as they erode my sense of certainty, until I reached a moment when I realized with a cold certainty, I may never return to the world I once knew. I'm now part of the glitch, trapped in a loop of shifting moments where nothing is as it seems, and every day, the illusion of normalcy slips further away into a realm of endless, inexplicable change. When I first moved into the apartment on Ashford Street, I assumed I was simply starting a new chapter in my life. The building was old but well-maintained, and nothing about it suggested that anything was out of the ordinary. The first few nights were uneventful, just the typical creaks of settling wood, the distant hum of city traffic, and the occasional groan of pipes. I chalked up these sounds to the natural aging of the structure. I even joked with friends that I might have purchased a haunted apartment, but I never expected anything more than the odd noise. It wasn't until the second week that I began noticing subtle discrepancies. One evening, while returning from a late shift at work, I saw a figure in the hallway mirror that vanished when I turned to look directly. I told myself it was a trick of the light or my tired mind playing tricks. But then I started hearing soft, rhythmic knocks at my door precisely at 2:17 a.m. every night. At first, I assumed it was a neighbor in distress or a prankster, but the timing was too precise, and no one ever answered when I knocked on the adjacent doors. Determined to find a logical explanation, I installed a small security camera in my living room facing the corridor. Reviewing the footage the next morning, I noticed something unsettling. A door at the end of the hall slowly creaked open for a few seconds, even though I was told that door was permanently locked and sealed off years ago. The timestamp on the video jittered briefly, and in that moment of distortion, I caught a glimpse of a face. It was gaunt, with eyes that seemed to stare right through the darkness, and an expression of anguish that sent chills down my spine. I paused the video repeatedly, trying to convince myself it was a camera glitch or a smudge on the lens, but the image was too distinct to ignore. Curiosity and mounting fear pushed me to research the building's history. I scoured local archives and discovered an old article about a fire in the 1960s that had claimed several lives in what was once a separate wing of the building. The victims were never fully recovered, and rumors of restless spirits had long circulated among former tenants. I began to wonder if the disturbances were connected to that tragic event. I approached the building manager with my findings, but he dismissed my concerns as old ghost stories meant to scare newcomers. His reaction did little to alleviate my growing anxiety. Over the next several nights, the strange occurrences escalated. I began to experience inexplicable cold spots in my apartment, and on one occasion, I found muddy footprints leading from the hallway right up to my front door, footprints that didn't match any shoes I owned. In an attempt to gather evidence, I documented everything meticulously in a journal and set up additional audio recorders throughout the building. One night, while reviewing a recording with a friend who remained skeptical, we both heard what sounded like heavy breathing in the background and a faint voice murmur, "Don't trust him," just before the sound abruptly cut off. Our equipment then malfunctioned in ways that defied technical explanation. Batteries drained inexplicably, and recordings played back at twice their normal speed. The more evidence I collected, the less I could rely on a rational explanation. I began to doubt my own perceptions. Was it possible that I was simply overanalyzing every creak and shadow in an old building? Or was there something else at work? My nights became a tense vigil, each knock and whisper deepening my unease. I even attempted to share my story on online forums, hoping that others might have experienced similar phenomena. Instead of support, I was met with dismissals and accusations of paranoia. Now, as I sit in the dim light of my living room, I am left with more questions than answers. Who or what is orchestrating these nightly disturbances? Could it be the unsettled spirits of those lost in the fire? Or is there another, more sinister force at work here? My attempts to record and document the events have only muddled the line between fact and imagination, leaving me isolated in my own fear. I am haunted by the possibility that I have uncovered a secret far greater than a simple coincidence, one that may have been dormant for decades, waiting for someone to notice. As I brace myself for another night at 2:17 a.m., I wonder if I will ever learn the truth, or if some mysteries are meant to remain unexplained. It began on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday when I met him by chance at the small coffee shop on my street, a place I'd frequented for years without incident. I was waiting in line, absorbed in my thoughts, when I noticed a man behind me whose presence felt oddly familiar. He wore a worn leather jacket and had a soft, knowing smile that suggested he knew more about me than I did about him. When our eyes met, he nodded in greeting before stepping aside, leaving me with an inexplicable sense of déjà vu that I couldn't quite shake. I dismissed it as a random encounter, nothing more than a fleeting moment in an otherwise mundane day. But from that moment on, subtle disturbances began to infiltrate my life. At first, it was little things. I would glance at the clock and swear that I had lost track of time. Minutes, sometimes hours, that simply vanished without explanation. On one occasion, I left my apartment at 8 a.m. and returned at 10:30, only to find that the world outside seemed unchanged, as if time itself had been reset. I tried to rationalize these lapses as distractions or oversleeping, yet a nagging feeling told me something deeper was at work. The man from the coffee shop started appearing in the most unlikely places. I saw him on my morning bus, his eyes briefly meeting mine as if acknowledging an unspoken secret. Later, at a colleague's birthday party, he stood in the corner conversing with someone, a conversation that I later learned had taken place at a similar party a year ago, down to the same awkward laughter and measured words. Every time I encountered him, he seemed to shift slightly. One day his hair was a shade darker, the next it was unexpectedly light. His smile, once warm and welcoming, sometimes appeared eerily forced. No matter where I saw him, there was an unsettling inconsistency, as though he were a variable in a program that was constantly updating its code. As the days wore on, the glitches began to spread beyond chance encounters. I started noticing that objects in my surroundings would subtly change when I wasn't looking. In my apartment, the bookshelf that had always been neatly arranged one way one day would be reorganized the next, as if someone had been there rearranging my belongings. I found photographs on my wall where the expressions of my friends and family had altered ever so slightly. A frown here, a smile there, details that didn't match my memories. I even discovered that passages from my favorite book were different, the sentences slightly rearranged, as though the text itself had been rewritten in the quiet hours of the night. The sensation of lost time became more frequent. There were mornings when I awoke with a profound emptiness, unable to recall entire chunks of the previous day. I meticulously kept a journal, documenting every moment in an effort to capture the truth, but even my writing betrayed gaps, a sudden blank page here, a line that ended mid-sentence there. My memories began to feel like unreliable snapshots, as if reality were being pieced together by a faulty editor. At work, my colleagues dismissed my concerns as stress-induced paranoia, assuring me that nothing had changed. Yet I could swear that during meetings, I caught glimpses of a man in the background, always standing at the edge of the room, watching. One evening, I returned home from a late shift to find my living room altered in a way that defied explanation. The furniture was arranged differently from the way I had left it, and a digital clock on the wall flickered erratically, its numbers momentarily displaying dates that made no sense. Years that hadn't yet come, or long past ones. In that moment, panic surged through me. I combed through my memories, trying to pinpoint when things had begun to unravel. But the more I searched, the more the lines between what I had experienced and what I now perceived blurred into a disorienting haze. I began to suspect that these glitches were not isolated events, but symptoms of something far larger, a fundamental breakdown in the fabric of reality. The man, who now seemed to be everywhere, appeared to be a harbinger of these distortions, his shifting features a visual manifestation of a reality that was no longer stable. I even started to see fragments of my own past being rewritten. Old conversations, long-forgotten promises, and even childhood memories seemed to morph in subtle ways, as though the timeline of my life were being edited in real time. Late one night, I found myself wandering the empty streets, desperate for answers. The familiar corners of my neighborhood looked alien, bathed in an eerie light that made everything feel unreal. I passed by the coffee shop where it all began, and there in the window, I saw him again. This time, he was standing alone, motionless, his eyes meeting mine with a quiet intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I approached him, my heart pounding, but when I reached out to speak, he simply smiled, a smile that conveyed both comfort and an unspoken warning, and then melted into the shadows as if he had never been there at all. Now, as I sit here, penning these words in the dim glow of a night that feels suspended in time, I am left with the inescapable realization that nothing is as it once was. The glitches have woven themselves into every facet of my existence, altering not just the world around me, but the very essence of my memories and perceptions. I have become part of this anomaly, a living fragment of a fractured reality. I no longer know if the moments I experience are real, or if they are mere echoes of a malfunctioning system that I can neither control nor escape. Every day, I awaken to a world that shifts and changes, a realm where certainty has dissolved into an endless loop of inexplicable distortions. And in that truth, I find a lingering terror that reality, the one I once trusted, has broken down completely, leaving me trapped in a glitch from which there may be no return. I first noticed something unsettling on a chilly autumn evening as I walked home along the quiet streets of Brookside. The neighborhood was typically calm, with neighbors chatting by their front lawns and soft laughter drifting from open windows. That night, however, an inexplicable tension hung in the air. I had just retrieved my mail from the box near my doorstep when I caught sight of a man leaning against a lamppost. At first glance, he looked like any other local, tall, in a worn leather jacket, and quietly observing the passersby. But something in his eyes was off. They were too fixed, too vacant, as if he were merely a shadow of a person rather than a living being. I brushed off the feeling as an overreaction to the crisp air and continued on my way. Over the next several days, minor incidents began to accumulate. I would leave my apartment to find that items I'd just put away, my keys, a favorite book, even my phone charger, had inexplicably vanished, only to reappear in odd places later. Once, I even found a pair of sunglasses on the bus seat that I distinctly remembered leaving at home. Each incident was small enough to dismiss as forgetfulness or simple coincidence. Yet every time I encountered these oddities, a creeping unease settled in my gut. I began to wonder if I was losing track of time or if something else was at play. One evening, while waiting in line at the local diner for my usual cup of coffee, I noticed a disturbing pattern. As I glanced around, several patrons seemed to behave as if they'd just forgotten a crucial conversation. A woman at the counter smiled at me warmly, then abruptly shifted her gaze as if she had no recollection of our brief exchange moments before. Even the diner's staff appeared distracted, their eyes darting nervously whenever they crossed paths with mine. I attempted to ask a few of them if something was amiss, but their responses were vague, almost as if they were following a script. It was in that moment that I realized I was not the only one noticing the inexplicable occurrences. The turning point came on a rain-soaked night when I found myself cornered in a narrow alley behind my apartment building. I had taken a shortcut to beat the downpour, but as I navigated the dim passageway, I felt a presence following me. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed off the graffiti-covered walls. I dared a glance over my shoulder, and saw the same man from the lamppost standing just at the edge of the alley, his expression unreadable in the murky light. My heart pounded as I quickened my pace, desperate to escape the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. When I finally burst onto the main street, the man was nowhere to be seen, yet the oppressive sensation of his gaze lingered, haunting every step I took. In the days that followed, the bizarre occurrences escalated further. I began noticing that people I had previously known were acting strangely around me. Friends I met on the street would offer a brief smile, only to look past me as if I were invisible moments later. I overheard snippets of conversations where acquaintances discussed events that I distinctly remembered happening, only to act as if they were talking about someone else entirely. It was as if I had been erased from the collective memory of those around me, replaced by a phantom version of myself that I couldn't recognize. This isolation grew into terror, and I started to suspect that I was being systematically removed from the fabric of reality. One particular night, while driving home late from work, I encountered a situation that confirmed my deepest fears. Stopped at a red light, I noticed a figure standing in the middle of the intersection, illuminated by the glow of streetlights. The figure wore a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured their face. When the light turned green, I continued driving, only to see the figure suddenly step off the curb and walk in the opposite direction. It was as if they had been waiting for the exact moment to cross paths with me. The shock of that moment sent a chill through my entire body. I felt my pulse race and my mind swirl with questions. Who was this person? Had they been following me all along? Was I being deliberately targeted? The anxiety of these encounters has since become a constant companion. I find myself double-checking locks, scanning the darkness for any sign of that stranger, and questioning the sincerity of every friendly gesture from people I once trusted. My life feels like a series of disconnected moments, with an ever-present undercurrent of dread I cannot escape. I have shared my experiences with a few close friends, only to have them dismiss my concerns as overactive paranoia. Some even suggested that stress or fatigue was to blame. But how can one rationalize a world where a man with vacant eyes appears on every corner, where memories and small objects vanish without explanation, and where familiar faces transform into unrecognizable masks of indifference? I write this not only as a cautionary tale, but as a desperate plea for anyone who might have encountered similar unsettling events. I fear that the stranger I witnessed, with his haunting gaze and inexplicable behavior, might not be an isolated incident. There are whispers in the dark corners of the city of others who have felt the same chilling presence, a force or figure that moves in the shadows, manipulating moments and memories. The realization that this phenomenon could be far more widespread than I ever imagined is deeply disturbing. Even now, as I sit in the dim glow of my apartment, I cannot shake the thought that he might be out there, lurking behind the next corner, waiting for his moment to reappear. I have taken to altering my routine, avoiding familiar paths, and even changing my phone number, yet the sense of being watched remains unyielding. In quiet moments, I hear echoes of footsteps outside my window and catch fleeting glimpses of a figure in reflective surfaces. It is a terror that permeates every aspect of my life, a constant reminder that some encounters are not easily forgotten. I share my story in the hope that you might heed this warning. If you ever find yourself alone on a dark street or notice people suddenly acting as if you were a stranger, be on guard. The man with the vacant eyes is not confined to a single place or moment. He could be anywhere, and you may never know when he chooses to strike again. It started as a perfectly ordinary day. I left work at my usual time, the sun dipping low behind the city skyline, and walked home with nothing more on my mind than dinner and a quiet night. As I pushed open the door to my apartment, I noticed my favorite mug, an old, chipped ceramic piece with a faded blue pattern, sitting exactly where I'd left it on the kitchen table. At first, it felt comforting, a small anchor in an otherwise hectic world. But later that evening, as I passed by the table in the dim light of my living room, I realized with a start that the mug was still there, unchanged, as if time had simply paused and then resumed without me even noticing. I shrugged it off, blaming it on my tired eyes and the familiar monotony of routine. The next day, the same peculiar sense of déjà vu crept in during my morning commute. I boarded the bus and, halfway to work, caught sight of a bright red sedan that I was sure I hadn't seen before. Then, as if on cue, the same car reappeared at the next stop. I found it odd, but chalked it up to the city's endless flow of vehicles and my own overactive imagination. Yet, as the day progressed, more glitches emerged. In the office, I experienced a moment of disorientation when I looked up from my computer and noticed that the arrangement of items on my desk was slightly different from what I remembered setting up that morning. A pen here, a notepad there, nothing major, but enough to make me pause and wonder if I had forgotten rearranging them. Over the following days, these anomalies grew more frequent. Returning home from work, I began to notice details that defied logic. The same tree outside my window, which I'd always admired for its lush, green leaves, seemed to flicker between its usual vibrant state and a barren, skeletal form, as if caught between seasons. The red sedan I'd seen on the bus appeared again at a traffic light near my building, its driver's face obscured by sunglasses that, on closer inspection, looked eerily blank, like a mask. I started to document everything in a small notebook, scribbling down observations and times, convinced that these were not mere coincidences, but signs of something far more unsettling. At first, I tried to rationalize the glitches. Perhaps I was simply tired, my mind playing tricks on me. But then I began to notice that these repeating details weren't isolated to physical objects. Conversations would sometimes loop or echo, with coworkers repeating phrases as if they were stuck on a record. One afternoon, while grabbing lunch in a nearby park, I heard a familiar voice recite the same greeting twice from a passerby, whose expression changed so subtly between the first and second utterance that I was sure I had witnessed a brief glitch in their personality. I confronted them, asking if they were feeling all right, but they only smiled politely and walked away, leaving me with a gnawing doubt that I was somehow the only one noticing. It wasn't long before I started feeling as though I wasn't merely an observer of these anomalies, but an unwilling participant in a system that was repeating itself without my consent. One evening, after returning home, I sat in my dimly lit living room, trying to piece together the fragments of my day. As I sipped a cup of tea, I noticed a subtle shift in the reflection of the window behind me, a slight distortion that made it seem as if the room was repeating itself in slow motion. I blinked, and the effect vanished, but the image remained seared into my mind. I began to wonder if these glitches were more than just random events, if perhaps reality itself was unstable, like a video game with a corrupt file. The situation reached a point where even my memories began to betray me. I would recall an event, a conversation with a friend, a meal at a restaurant. But when I tried to recount it later, the details were fuzzy, as though parts of the experience had been erased or overwritten. I tried cross-referencing my notes with my phone's timeline, but even that offered no solace. The same familiar routes I took daily fell off. Street signs seemed to flicker between old and new names, and familiar storefronts appeared with logos and color schemes that I didn't remember. Each glitch was a tiny crack in the facade of normalcy, and together they formed a mosaic of inexplicable repetition. One night, driven by a mix of desperation and curiosity, I stayed up late trying to capture these moments on my camera. I set it up in my living room and waited. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the room seemed to pause. The clock on the wall froze for a split second before resuming its march, and for a moment, I swear I saw the mug on my table levitate slightly, as if caught in a time lapse that only I could perceive. The video recorded nothing that made sense of a blurry distortion, then nothing at all. I replayed it over and over, each time hoping for clarity, but the images were too fragmented to provide answers. Now, as I sit in the silence of my apartment, every shadow and every flicker of light feels like a deliberate message, a reminder that the world I knew might just be an illusion. The repetition is relentless. A red sedan that appears and disappears, a tree that shifts between seasons, a familiar room that subtly resets itself as if programmed to do so. I have become hyper-aware, no longer trusting the flow of time or the consistency of my surroundings. I wonder if I am trapped in a loop, a glitch in a system that I once believed was real. The more I search for answers, the more I realize that I might be the anomaly, a tiny, persistent error in an otherwise smooth program of existence. I have reached a point where the idea of normal reality seems like a distant memory. What if the world around me isn't as solid as I once believed? What if every moment is simply a line of code, subject to random rewrites and unexpected resets? I am haunted by the possibility that I have become part of this glitch, an unintentional player in a simulation that I can neither control nor escape. As I stare out the window at the flickering streetlight and the familiar red sedan passing by for the umpteenth time, I confront the unsettling truth. Reality might be fake, programmed, and I may never return to the certainty of what I once thought was real. And in that revelation, I am left wondering, if everything is a glitch, does it even matter? I first encountered him on a brisk autumn evening in a town where I had recently moved for a fresh start. I was sitting in a small, warmly lit cafe near my new apartment, lost in a book and a cup of coffee, when a man in a neat, dark coat approached my table. With a friendly smile and a calm demeanor, he introduced himself as Daniel. He made small talk about the weather and the charm of the town, and I found his conversation pleasant and genuine. At that moment, I dismissed any hint of unease as nothing more than the natural curiosity of a friendly stranger. Over the next week, I began to see Daniel in various places, at the local grocery store, during my morning walks in the park, even waiting by the bus stop at the same time I usually arrived. His appearances were always casual, his greetings warm, as if we had known each other for years. I initially welcomed these encounters, thinking they were the coincidences of a small town where everyone crossed paths. However, subtle details began to emerge that I couldn't quite explain. One afternoon, while chatting with a cashier at the supermarket, I casually mentioned that I had just switched my phone number after a minor scam. The conversation shifted back to small talk, and I thought nothing of it, until later that evening when I received a text message from an unknown number saying, "I hope your new number brings you peace." The message was oddly specific, echoing details I had only mentioned in passing. I brushed it off as a weird coincidence at first, but then it happened again. The next day, while I was leaving work, Daniel remarked in passing, "It must be liberating to leave old numbers behind." I felt a chill run down my spine, wondering how he could possibly know such personal information. As the days turned into weeks, his behavior grew increasingly disconcerting. In our conversations, Daniel began to ask questions that felt more invasive. During one encounter at the park, he asked, "Where do you usually go when you need to clear your mind?" And later, during our chance meeting at a community event, he mentioned details about my daily routine that I had never shared with anyone. Each time his tone was kind, his smile gentle, but his questions pried a little too deeply into my private life. I tried to rationalize it by thinking he was simply being friendly, but the nagging thought persisted. He always seemed to know a bit too much about me. One night, after a long and exhausting day, I took a different route home to avoid the usual crowd. As I walked down a dimly lit side street, I saw him again. Daniel was leaning against a brick wall under a flickering street lamp, his eyes fixed on me. He didn't approach, but his mere presence in that secluded part of town made my heart race. I quickened my pace, my mind filled with uneasy questions. Why was he here? Had I done something to invite his attention? His presence began to feel less like a comforting coincidence and more like a deliberate act. The final straw came on a rainy evening when I returned to my apartment after a late shift. I found a small envelope on my doorstep, sealed with a plain sticker. Inside was a single note in neat handwriting. "I know what you fear." The message was so simple, yet it struck me with a force that left me trembling. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of my floor, every whisper of wind against the window, felt like a reminder that I was being watched. Desperate for answers, I retraced my steps over the past few weeks, compiling every interaction, every overheard comment. I even checked social media and local community boards, looking for any mention of someone with his description. But there was nothing, no record of him, no shared connections. I tried confronting him the next time we met casually at a town event, asking directly, "Why do you seem to know so much about me?" He only smiled softly, his eyes kind yet unreadable, and said, "Isn't it nice to feel understood?" His response, intended to be comforting, only deepened my dread. Now, as I sit in the dim light of my apartment, the line between coincidence and something far more sinister blurs with every passing moment. I find myself questioning if I've become part of someone's obsessive plan, a pawn in a game where my privacy is slowly being eroded by a stranger whose intentions I cannot decipher. I have no clear explanation, and every rational thought seems to crumble in the face of these eerie, unaccountable encounters. Was it all just a series of bizarre coincidences? Or is someone truly tracking me, gradually seeping into every corner of my life? The uncertainty is maddening, and as I write these words, I am left with the chilling possibility that the friendly stranger I once met may have been the harbinger of something much darker than I ever could have imagined. I never believed in the supernatural until that night in late autumn, when the silence of the countryside whispered secrets that only the dead could keep. I had inherited my great-uncle's old farmhouse, a decaying structure isolated in the woods, and had come to spend a few nights sorting through his belongings. The first night passed with little incident. The creaks of the ancient floorboards and the rustling of wind through broken windows were easily explained as natural wear and tear. But on the second night, something changed. At precisely 2:17 a.m., I awoke to a faint scraping sound in the hallway. My heart pounded as I reached for the lamp, its dim glow casting eerie shadows along the corridor. The sound stopped abruptly, as if whoever or whatever had been moving decided to vanish. I tried convincing myself it was nothing more than the house settling, but deep down, I sensed an inexplicable presence. The following day, I discovered odd markings on the wooden banister and unexplained footprints leading to a dead end behind the stairs. They were small, almost childlike, yet too deliberate to be the work of an animal. That evening, while I was reviewing old letters in the dusty study, I found a faded journal tucked behind a row of ancient books. The entries, written in shaky handwriting, described nightly visitations by a figure with hollow eyes and a relentless, cold stare. The writer detailed the sounds of dragging feet and soft, unintelligible whispers that seeped through the walls. As I read, I couldn't shake the feeling that the journal was written by the same unseen presence that had been haunting me. My mind raced with questions, each more disturbing than the last. Who or what was writing these entries? Was it a desperate cry for help or a sinister documentation of something far more malevolent? Night fell again, and I felt an urgent compulsion to lock every door and window. I double-checked every corner, ensuring the farmhouse was secure, yet the oppressive sensation of being watched persisted. I decided to set up a small video camera in the hallway where I had first heard the scratching. Hours later, in the review, I saw nothing unusual, until I rewound to a moment when the camera's feed briefly distorted, revealing a fleeting silhouette in the background. It was not human. It moved with an unnatural jerk, and its eyes, if they could be called that, glowed faintly red before disappearing into the shadows. The footage stopped abruptly, leaving me with a chill that I couldn't explain. The next morning, as I sipped coffee in the fading light of dawn, I noticed that my reflection in the window no longer looked quite like me. For a split second, I saw another face superimposed over my own, a gaunt, sorrowful visage that melted away as quickly as it appeared. Panic set in, and I began to doubt my sanity. I felt an overwhelming need to leave, yet the house itself seemed to hold me captive with its sinister charm. Every room echoed with whispers, and every creak seemed to carry the weight of unseen eyes. One night, the phenomenon escalated. I awoke to a cold presence at the foot of my bed. I could not move. My limbs felt as if they were encased in ice. A voice, faint but distinct, spoke my name in a tone of warning. The room darkened unnaturally, and I could see the outline of a figure at the door. It was the same shadow from the camera, standing silently, its gaze fixed upon me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The oppressive darkness swallowed the room, leaving me alone with that paralyzing fear until the first rays of morning light finally forced the presence away. I left that day, but the experience clings to me like a cold hand. In the weeks that followed, I found remnants of that night. Scratched symbols on the walls of my car, persistent dreams of a gaunt face looming in the darkness, and an unshakable feeling that I was being followed. I have attempted to piece together the mystery of that farmhouse, but every lead spirals into deeper uncertainty. Even now, as I write this, I am plagued by the question, was it a malevolent spirit, or something far more sinister that exists in the spaces between our reality and the unknown? I can only share my experience in hopes that someone might understand the creeping dread of that unseen watcher, whose story, like the entries in that ancient journal, remains unfinished. And sometimes, late at night, when I think I am alone, I wonder if the real horror is not what happened in that farmhouse, but what still follows me, hidden just beyond the edge of my sight. My sleep is shattered by fleeting moments of darkness where I catch glimpses of movement in the periphery, shadows that dart away when I turn to look. I now find myself questioning every creak, every whisper, and every inexplicable chill that crawls along my spine. In the silence of night, I hear the soft scratch of nails against wood and the slow, deliberate tapping at my window, a persistent reminder that I am never truly alone. The fear has seeped into every corner of my mind, turning the familiar into the grotesque and the ordinary into a nightmare waiting to unfold. I have tried to rationalize these experiences as tricks of the mind or the residual echoes of a creaking old building, but logic fails when the impossible seems to manifest at every turn. As days blur into sleepless nights, I can no longer distinguish the line between reality and nightmare. The presence, whatever it is, remains an ever-looming specter in my life, a reminder that some mysteries are best left unsolved. And so I write this not as a tale of closure, but as a record, a final plea to those who might one day encounter the inexplicable. Be wary of what lurks in the spaces between our understanding, for its intentions are as inscrutable as the dark. The farmhouse may be far behind me, but its shadows persist, echoing in every moment of solitude, and I fear that one day they may finally catch up with me. Even now, as I put pen to digital paper in a quiet moment of desperate reflection, the shadows of that night linger in the recesses of my memory. I wonder if somewhere, somehow, the same mysterious presence observes me still. In every whisper of wind and every unexplained creak in my home, I sense a fragment of that unspeakable terror. The farmhouse was not the end of the story, but merely a chapter in an endless narrative of unknown horrors. While I strive to reclaim my peace, the uncertainty that shrouds my existence persists, a relentless reminder that some mysteries are destined to remain unsolved, lingering like a haunting refrain in the silence of our lives. I leave you with my account not to alarm, but to caution, for in the quiet moments between dusk and dawn, when reality blurs with the realm of nightmares, you may catch a glimpse of what lies beyond our comprehension. The watcher, the dark presence, might just be waiting for you too. I first noticed him on a rainy Tuesday afternoon as I was leaving work. I had just stepped off the bus when I saw a man in a dark, worn jacket standing under a flickering street lamp, his face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. At first glance, he seemed unremarkable, just another commuter waiting for a ride. But there was something in the way he watched me that set my nerves on edge. I shrugged it off as an overactive imagination fueled by the gloomy weather. The next week, I began encountering small oddities that, in isolation, could be chalked up to coincidence. I'd misplaced my umbrella one morning, only to find it propped against the cafe door where I usually grab my coffee. A couple of days later, a neighbor in my apartment complex complimented me on the color of my scarf in a way that felt too calculated, as if they'd been scrutinizing my outfit earlier. Each incident on its own seemed trivial, a misplaced item, a quirky remark, but as they accumulated, a pattern began to emerge that made my skin crawl. It started with casual conversations at the local grocery store. One evening, as I was selecting produce, the same man from the bus appeared in the aisle. He greeted me with a warm smile and a comment about how you always choose the best fruits, his tone overly familiar. I tried to offer a polite smile in return, but something about his gaze felt unsettling. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing his presence in places where I spent the most time: a bus stop, the small park near my apartment, even outside the building where I worked. Each time, he'd be there, his eyes locking with mine for a heartbeat longer than expected. At first, I rationalized his behavior. Perhaps he was just friendly, or maybe he was new to the area and trying to make connections. But then the compliments started shifting. One day, as I was leaving the office, he asked in a low, measured tone, "Do you ever feel like your life is not entirely your own?" The question, posed as if it were a casual remark, sent a shiver down my spine. I brushed it off as an odd attempt at small talk and walked away, but his words haunted me throughout the day. The situation escalated subtly. I began receiving inexplicable phone calls in the evenings, short, static-filled bursts of nothing more than soft breathing, and, on one occasion, what sounded like my own name whispered in a rasp. I checked my caller ID, only to see an unknown number. At work, a co-worker mentioned that she'd seen me chatting animatedly with someone in the hallway, though I was alone. I dismissed it as a misunderstanding, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even in places where I should have been safe. One evening, after returning home from a late shift, I noticed that the locks on my door had been tampered with, barely enough to force a new set, but enough for my gut to scream that something was very wrong. My hands were trembling as I double-checked every window and door, ensuring they were secure. I considered calling the police, but the idea of involving someone else in what I feared might be an escalating situation made my chest tighten with dread. That night, I heard soft knocking at my door, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone clearing their throat. I peered through the peephole and, in the dim light, saw his silhouette standing motionless on the porch. I couldn't muster the courage to open the door. I just listened as the knock faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence that felt both heavy and charged. In the following days, I started piecing together the encounters in a notebook. The timeline was unnerving. Friendly greetings, odd compliments, invasive questions, and now subtle intrusions into the sanctity of my home. I began to wonder if he was trying to gain control over my life in a way that went beyond mere curiosity. At the coffee shop, he once remarked, "You seem so alone, even when you're surrounded by people. It's as if you're trying to hide from someone or something." His words, delivered with a calm certainty, struck a chord in me. I started avoiding the places where I'd seen him, altering my routine in an effort to elude his ever-watchful presence. I reached out to a close friend about what was happening. Over dinner at a quiet restaurant, I described the increasingly invasive encounters, expecting concern or advice. Instead, she listened with a furrowed brow and then said, "Maybe you're just reading too much into coincidences. People can be oddly observant sometimes, and stress can make everything seem more sinister." Her words provided little comfort. I couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that something more deliberate was at work. A calculated effort to assert control, a quiet prelude to something far more dangerous. The tipping point came one night when I returned home to find a small, handwritten note slipped under my door. In elegant, looping script, it read, "Soon you'll understand." I was left staring at the note, my heart pounding as I tried to decipher its meaning. Was it a threat? A promise? I felt a primal urge to flee, to get as far away from that stranger as possible, but the cold grip of uncertainty held me in place. Now, as I sit alone in my dimly lit apartment, I can't help but feel that my life has been subtly hijacked by someone whose benign exterior masks something far more controlling and possibly dangerous. I still see him occasionally, just a glimpse in a crowd, a reflection in a window, or a shadow at the edge of my vision. And each time, my pulse races with fear and confusion. Was I simply overreacting to harmless interactions? Or was there truly a sinister force lurking behind those disarming smiles? I don't have the answers, and perhaps I never will. All I know is that the memory of his piercing gaze and those quiet, unsettling words continues to haunt me, leaving me to wonder if I'm being targeted or if I've let my imagination run wild. And somewhere out there, He might be watching, waiting for the right moment to appear again. I first noticed him on a gray, overcast afternoon at the little corner cafe on Linden Street. I was waiting for my usual order, a steaming cup of chamomile tea, when I glanced up to see a man sitting alone by the window. He was dressed in a simple navy coat and a knit cap, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses. At first, his presence seemed entirely innocuous, just another patron enjoying a quiet moment. I returned to my book, dismissing the fleeting sense of unease as nothing more than a trick of my imagination. Over the next few days, I began to see him in other places. One evening, while walking home from the grocery store, I caught sight of him under a flickering street lamp. He stood there motionless, as if waiting for something, his silhouette blurred by the falling rain. I quickened my pace, trying to convince myself that it was a mere coincidence. Later that week, while jogging in the park at dawn, I saw him again, seated on a bench, gazing in the same direction as if he were waiting for someone. His face remained expressionless, and though he didn't approach, I felt as if his eyes were following every step I took. At first, the encounters were sparse and could easily be dismissed as chance. But soon, his appearances became disturbingly regular. One sunny afternoon, as I was picking out a book at the local bookstore, he emerged from the fiction section and struck up a conversation. "I've noticed you have a very discerning taste," he said, his voice soft yet oddly compelling. His compliment seemed sincere, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that his words carried an unsettling undertone. I replied with a hesitant thank you, feeling a shiver run down my spine as I realized that he knew exactly which section I had been browsing moments before. The incidents escalated slowly. One evening, while I was waiting for the bus, I spotted him again, this time leaning casually against the stop sign. His eyes briefly met mine, and he offered a polite nod that felt too calculated. I began to worry that I was imagining things, but then I noticed subtle details. The way he always seemed to be in the same spot at the same time, how his presence coincided with moments when I felt particularly vulnerable. At a friend's dinner party a few nights later, I distinctly recall him entering through the back door, blending in with the crowd, yet I was sure I hadn't seen him before. The more I tried to pinpoint his significance, the more elusive he became, a constant, inexplicable presence that blurred the line between coincidence and intentionality. Sleep, once a refuge, turned into a restless ordeal. I started having dreams of endless corridors and shadowy figures, always with his indistinct face lurking at the edge. I found myself checking over my shoulder even in the safety of my own home, the memory of his persistent gaze haunting every quiet moment. My anxiety mounted, and with it, a deep-seated sense of being observed, as if my every move was being cataloged by someone, or something, whose motives I could not fathom. Desperate for some semblance of control, I altered my routines. I switched the route to work, avoided my usual coffee shop, and even began leaving my apartment at different times. Yet no matter what I did, he appeared, on a crowded bus, on a dimly lit street corner, sometimes even reflected in the glass of a shop window when I wasn't expecting it. Each encounter left me feeling more exposed, as if I were slipping further into a narrative that I had no power over, a subplot in someone else's carefully orchestrated plan. One night, after returning from a late shift, I discovered a small envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a single handwritten note that read, "I've been waiting." The neat, deliberate script sent a cold shiver through me. Was it a threat, a joke, or a prelude to something more sinister? I couldn't decide, but the note solidified the feeling that this wasn't random at all. The knowledge that someone might be orchestrating these encounters for a purpose I couldn't decipher left me feeling helpless and exposed. I confided in a couple of close friends, hoping their rational perspectives would ground me. Their responses were polite but distant. One suggested I was merely the victim of a series of coincidences. Another hinted that stress might be distorting my perception. Their reassurances did little to dispel the nagging fear that had wormed its way into my every thought. The more I tried to piece together the pattern of his appearances, the more I felt like a character trapped in a surreal, unfolding drama where I was powerless to rewrite the script. Now, As I sit alone in my dimly lit apartment with the echoes of his occasional, ghostly presence reverberating in my mind, I'm left with a lingering question that chills me to the bone. Is it all just a series of coincidences born of an overactive imagination? Or am I truly being stalked by someone whose quiet, relentless pursuit has woven itself into the fabric of my life? I can't shake the feeling that his benign exterior masks something far more deliberate and unnerving. Every shadow, every unexpected encounter leaves me questioning if this is merely chance, or if somewhere out there, someone is meticulously watching, waiting for the next moment to step out of the darkness. I first started noticing it about a month ago. At least, I think it was a month. Tom has become strange. It wasn't a sudden thing, more like a slow unraveling. Little things at first. I would wake up in bed with no memory of falling asleep, convinced I had been in the living room only moments before. Conversations would feel out of sync, like I had already had them but couldn't recall the details. The worst part was when people started acting as if I had done or said things I had no memory of. It started with my co-worker, Jenna. One morning, she gave me a confused look and said, "Are you feeling okay? You were acting really weird yesterday. You blinked here. What do you mean?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "You left early without saying anything. And when I asked if you were all right, you just kind of stared at me, like you didn't recognize me." I laughed, but it felt forced. "I don't remember that at all." "Are you sure?" Jenna nodded, but there was an uneasy look in her eyes. I shrugged it off, convincing myself that she must have misunderstood. Maybe she saw someone else who looked like me. But then it started happening more frequently. I would find things in my apartment moved to strange places. A book in the fridge, my phone left in the bathroom sink. I started missing entire chunks of time. 1 minute, I'd be sitting at my desk at work, and the next, I'd be outside, my hands shaking with no memory of leaving my office. My boss even called me in, concerned that I had been acting distant and forgetting things she was sure I had been told. At night, it was worse. I would wake up, drenched in sweat, my sheets tangled around me like I had been fighting something in my sleep. There were moments where I would see myself in the mirror and feel a disconnect, as if I wasn't fully in my own body. I caught myself staring too long at my reflection, my breath coming in short gasps, unable to remember what I had just been doing seconds before. One morning, I woke up to find a note on my bedside table in my own handwriting. It read, "Don't let them in." I had no memory of writing it. Panic set in then. I started keeping a journal, writing down everything I did throughout the day, trying to piece together the gaps. But some mornings, when I flipped open my notebook, pages were missing. Entire entries I was sure I had written were gone, torn out neatly, as if someone or something didn't want me to remember. The worst moment came last week. I was at a small diner near my apartment, trying to distract myself with a cup of coffee and a newspaper, when the waitress, a woman I had never met before, smiled at me and said, "You want the usual?" I froze. "What?" She laughed, tilting her head. "The usual. Black coffee, 2 sugars, blueberry muffin. You come in here almost every night." I had never been to that diner before in my life. My blood ran cold. I think you have me confused with someone else." The smile faltered. "No, I'm pretty sure it's you. You always sit in that booth." I glanced around, suddenly feeling like the walls were pressing in. The diner was small, with only a few customers scattered around, none of them looking in my direction. Had I been here before? Had I sat in this very booth, spoken to this very waitress? And if so, why couldn't I remember? I left without finishing my coffee. That night, I locked my bedroom door and placed a chair against it, as if that would somehow stop whatever was happening to me. I forced myself to stay awake, to pay attention, to see if I could catch myself slipping away. But sleep took me eventually, and when I woke up, I was in my car, parked on a deserted road outside of town. The engine was running. My hands were gripping the steering wheel. I had no idea how I got there. I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror, my chest heaving. The face looking back at me was my own, but something was wrong. My eyes were bloodshot, like I had been crying, and there were faint red marks around my neck. My lips moved, but no sound came out. I forced myself to breathe, to focus. I checked my phone, no calls, no messages, nothing that could explain why I was here. The clock read 3:42 a.m. The last thing I remembered was locking my door at 9 p.m. 4. Missing. Hours. I turned the car around and drove home, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Since then, I've started noticing them. People who weren't there before. People who watch me. A woman at the grocery store who was standing by the frozen foods, staring at me unblinking until I left the aisle. A man in a dark coat who sat 2 tables away from me at a cafe, pretending to read a newspaper but never actually turning the page. Faces in the crowd that seemed too familiar. People I swear I recognize, but I don't know why. I tried telling Jenna. I told her everything. She listened, nodding slowly, her expression unreadable. Then she said, "We had this conversation already." I felt my heart stop. "What?" She sighed. "You told me all of this last week. The missing time, the strange people, the diner. You told me you were scared. And then you said, 'Never mind.'" I grabbed her wrist. "What did I say?" Jenna hesitated. "You said you figured it out, that you understood now. And then you smiled at me, but it wasn't you." I barely heard the rest of what she said. My mind was racing. If I had figured something out, why couldn't I remember it? If I had solved this, why did I let it slip away? I don't know what's happening to me. I don't know if this is a breakdown or something else. But I do know one thing. Whatever's controlling me, whatever's making me lose time, it doesn't want me to remember. And that terrifies me more than anything. I first noticed something was off on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday morning. I woke up to the familiar sound of my alarm, stretched, and began my routine. But as I made my way to the kitchen, I paused at the sight of my digital clock. For a split second, the numbers glitched, a flicker of 7:58 before snapping back to 7:59, then 8 o'clock. I chalked it up to a power surge or a faulty display, nothing more. I prepared my coffee, sat by the window, and watched the world outside come to life. It was ordinary, predictable, until I left the apartment. On my walk to the bus stop, I passed the same row of trees I'd always seen, their leaves a constant patchwork of green and gold. But today, one tree's bark appeared unnaturally smooth, almost plastic-like, as if it had been repainted. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. The tree was there, its bark perfectly ordinary now, as though nothing had happened. I wondered if I'd imagined it, but the sensation of being wronged by reality lingered. At the bus stop, I noticed the same man I'd seen the previous day, a middle-aged guy in a worn jacket who always sat on the same bench. His posture was rigid, his eyes distant, and for a moment he stared directly at me. I felt a jolt of recognition, as if he were someone I should know, but I couldn't place him. I boarded the bus, trying to dismiss the nagging unease. Yet every bump and swerve of the vehicle seemed to echo that uncanny feeling. During work, the strangeness deepened. In the break room, I overheard my co-worker, Mark, telling a story about a bizarre glitch he'd experienced at home. A moment when time seemed to stutter and repeat itself. I dismissed it as a side effect of sleep deprivation, but later that day, when I checked my own emails, I discovered 2 copies of the same message in my sent folder, each with a timestamp 2 minutes apart. The content was identical, down to every punctuation mark, as if my computer had somehow decided to repeat itself. My logical mind scrambled for a rational explanation, but nothing made sense. The sense of repetition intensified that evening on my way home. I decided to take a detour through the park, hoping the change in scenery would soothe my growing anxiety. As I walked along the familiar winding path, I suddenly became aware of a disconcerting echo. A moment before, I distinctly recalled passing a solitary bench under a large oak tree. When I reached that spot, however, the bench wasn't there at all, only an empty patch of grass, as if it had been erased. I waited, heart pounding, half expecting it to reappear, but the bench remained absent. I tried to rationalize the missing object as a maintenance oversight. Yet deep down I felt reality was somehow rewriting itself around me. The following morning, the glitches escalated in a way that left me questioning whether I was witnessing a series of coincidences or if the world itself was malfunctioning. I left my apartment determined to record every anomaly. On my commute, I noticed a street sign that once read Maple Avenue now displayed Mabel Avenue. A familiar coffee shop had its name slightly altered on the awning, the letters rearranged in a subtle, disorienting way. I snapped pictures with my phone, only to have the images appear normal upon review. No sign of the aberrations I had just witnessed. At work, my anxiety reached a fever pitch. I found that my colleagues, usually reliable in their behavior, began to speak in oddly measured tones, their conversations occasionally repeating phrases as if they were stuck in a loop. When I mentioned my concerns, they exchanged awkward glances and assured me everything was fine. But their eyes held a fleeting, shared uncertainty that I couldn't ignore. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trapped in a broken system. I replayed the day's events in my mind, the glitches layering upon one another like a series of unsolvable puzzles. I considered the possibility that I was the only one noticing these changes, a lone observer in a world that was silently resetting itself, as if reality were an elaborate simulation suffering from a critical error. I scrolled through online forums, searching for any mention of similar experiences. I found scattered accounts of people describing moments when the world around them glitched, a momentary freeze in time, a misplaced object, a face that flickered between familiarity and alienation. The stories were too disparate to be linked, yet they resonated with the growing dread in my chest. Now, as I sit here writing this, I can't help but feel that each moment is a fragile construct, a line of code waiting to be rewritten. The sense of repetition is inescapable, as if I'm caught in a loop that I can't break free from. Every time I try to pin down a single instance of the glitch, a misplaced tree bark, a missing bench, a jumbled street sign, it slips away into the background of my memory, leaving only the undeniable feeling that something is fundamentally wrong with the fabric of reality. I'm increasingly convinced that I'm not merely observing strange coincidences, but that I've become part of something larger, a systemic breakdown of the world as I know it. I don't know if it's just a fleeting glitch, a momentary error in perception, or if reality itself is unraveling. All I know is that I can't return to the comfort of certainty. Every day, I wake up wondering if the same moments will repeat, if the same oddities will reappear, and if one day the glitch will become so severe that nothing will seem real at all. As I write these words, the lights in my room flicker briefly, and for a moment, I swear I hear a distant hum, a reminder that perhaps, somewhere deep within the code of existence, something is amiss. I'm left with no answers, only an overwhelming suspicion that the world I thought I knew is nothing more than a fractured illusion, and that I am trapped inside it, watching as reality itself glitches into oblivion. I first noticed something off on an ordinary Tuesday. I'd misplaced my watch, something I'd worn every day without fail, and assumed I'd simply forgotten where I put it. But after a frantic search through every room, I discovered it tucked neatly into the pages of an old magazine I hadn't even read. I chalked it up to my absent-mindedness, but the incident lingered like an unwelcome thought. Over the next few days, minor mishaps multiplied. A pen that I distinctly remembered leaving on the desk ended up in the kitchen drawer. The light in the hallway flickered on and off in what could have been explained as a faulty bulb. At first, these oddities were trivial, nothing more than coincidences in a busy life. Yet a deeper, unsettling sensation began to grow. During a late afternoon walk, I passed a neighbor I'd seen 100 times. He paused and smiled warmly, and for a brief moment, his eyes shone with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When I greeted him later that day, he looked puzzled, as if our prior exchange was completely foreign. I tried to dismiss it as a slip of memory, but the encounter planted a seed of doubt. Over the following week, people around me began to act in increasingly perplexing ways. Friends would recount conversations as if they'd never occurred, and strangers in familiar places seemed to vanish from memory the instant I mentioned them. It was as though my recollections existed in a parallel narrative that only I could perceive. One rainy evening, while I was huddled in my cramped apartment trying to work on a project, I heard a soft knock at my door. I opened it expecting a delivery or a neighbor in need, but instead found an envelope addressed to me in a handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a single sentence. They're rewriting everything. I felt a chill and a creeping dread that I couldn't shake. My mind raced for a rational explanation. Some kind of elaborate prank, perhaps, but deep down, I suspected there was more at play. The peculiarities escalated with alarming regularity. One morning, I noticed that the mug I'd left on the counter had been replaced with an identical one, but it had subtle differences, tiny scratches, a different placement of a chip that made it unmistakably not the same. When I asked my roommate about it, he furrowed his brow and insisted he hadn't touched anything. At work, I recalled a conversation with a coworker about plans for a weekend getaway, only for her to later claim that conversation never happened. I began to feel increasingly alienated in my own life, as if I were watching events unfold from a distance, powerless to change the narrative. I took to keeping a detailed journal, recording every odd occurrence, every conversation that later seemed to vanish into thin air. The entries became progressively frantic, filled with descriptions of objects that disappeared only to reappear in odd places, and people whose faces shifted subtly from day to day. One particularly unnerving entry read, "I saw you yesterday, but today your eyes are empty, like you've forgotten who I am." I signed it with my name, though even I wasn't sure it belonged to the person staring back at me in the mirror. Then came the night that shattered any semblance of normalcy. I was alone in my apartment when the television, which had been silent for days, suddenly switched on to a channel I'd never seen before. The screen filled with static before an image materialized, a blurry figure standing in the doorway of my living room. I blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving only the static and a lingering sense of dread. I called a friend in desperation, but when I described what I'd seen, her voice was cautious and dismissive, as if she believed I was conflating a trick of the light with reality. "Maybe you're just tired," she said, leaving me to question whether I was losing my grip on what was real. Every subsequent day, the anomalies deepened. Conversations reset mid-sentence. Familiar faces in the grocery store would smile at me before looking away as if embarrassed by their own recognition. I began to suspect that my very existence was being altered, that I was no longer the author of my own memories, but merely an actor reciting lines written by someone or something else. I started noticing reflections in mirrors that didn't quite match my own, as if a second, unaccountable presence lurked behind my image. Now, as I sit in the dim light of a sleepless night, I record these thoughts with a hand that trembles with uncertainty. The everyday has dissolved into a puzzle of shifting details and unreliable recollections. I fear that every moment might be a carefully constructed illusion, a manipulation of my reality that I can neither control nor fully understand. Am I losing my mind, or is there a force beyond my comprehension that is meticulously rewriting my past and present? I have no clear answers, only mounting evidence that nothing is as it once was. I leave this account as a record of events that have spiraled beyond ordinary explanation, a desperate attempt to cling to some semblance of truth. Even as I write, the voices in my head question each word, each memory, making it impossible to discern whether these experiences are merely figments of a troubled imagination or if an unseen puppeteer is rearranging the threads of my life. And so, I continue to wonder, in a world where nothing is fixed, is there any reality left at all? I moved into the modest apartment on Elm Street on a crisp autumn evening, thinking that a fresh start was exactly what I needed. The building was old but charming, with creaking floors and a history that whispered from every wall. At first, everything seemed ordinary. The faint hum of the heating system, the occasional groan of settling wood, even the rustle of leaves against the window, all felt like simple quirks of an aged structure. I told myself that every unusual noise had a rational explanation. During the first week, I noticed small oddities that I could easily dismiss as coincidences. A door left slightly ajar when I was sure I had closed it, footsteps echoing in the hallway when no one else was home, and soft knocks that faded into silence as quickly as they came. I chalked it up to the building's eccentricities and my own nerves adjusting to a new environment. I even started a journal, noting each incident with the detached curiosity of someone who believed there must be a logical explanation. But then things began to escalate in ways I could not ignore. One evening, while I sat alone in the living room, I heard a low murmur coming from the kitchen, like whispered conversations that were too distinct to be the wind and too articulate to be imagined. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone and recorded the sound, planning to analyze it later. When I played it back, all I heard was a soft, indistinct hum that left me with more questions than answers. I sent the clip to a friend who worked in audio engineering, expecting him to laugh it off as ambient interference. Instead, he urged caution, hinting that such anomalies might precede events that defied simple logic. The following night, while making coffee in the dim, early hours, I caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection of my stainless steel fridge, a dark, slender shape drifting behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, only to find nothing there. My rational mind insisted it was a trick of the light or perhaps a lingering sleep-induced hallucination. Yet, that explanation did little to quell the growing unease that settled in my chest like a stone. Determined to unearth a sensible cause, I set up a small camera in the hallway where I first heard those unexplained footsteps. I left it running overnight, hoping to capture evidence of a draft, a stray animal, or just the building's natural settling. The next morning, as I reviewed the footage, I froze at a single frame. A vague, dark figure hovered near the corridor's end, moving with a stillness that was anything but ordinary. Its outline blurred into the shadows as quickly as it appeared. I questioned everything. Was it a trick of exposure, a mere shadow cast by a passing car's light, or something entirely different? In the weeks that followed, the incidents multiplied. Objects in my apartment inexplicably shifted positions. I found personal items moved from where I distinctly remembered leaving them. My journal filled with frantic entries, each one more desperate than the last to record these anomalies with photos and recordings. I even approached my neighbor, an elderly woman with kind eyes, about the disturbances. She listened silently and said, "This building has its secrets, dear. Sometimes you see what shouldn't be seen and hear what shouldn't be heard." Her cryptic words, meant to comfort, only deepened my isolation and dread. One night, as if drawn by an unseen force, I discovered a narrow corridor behind my linen closet that I'd never noticed before. Dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, the corridor led to a heavy wooden door bearing strange, etched symbols that glowed faintly in the gloom. My pulse raced as I pushed it open, revealing a small, hidden room cluttered with dusty relics, old photographs, handwritten letters, and a journal belonging to a previous tenant. Its entries detailed experiences disturbingly similar to my own. Whispers in empty rooms, fleeting images in mirrors, and a constant, unnerving sensation of being watched by something unseen. The journal's final entry was the most disturbing. It spoke of an ancient presence that existed in the thin spaces between reality and dreams, a force that thrived on fear and uncertainty. I tried to dismiss it as the ramblings of a troubled mind, yet the details matched the anomalies in my own apartment with unnerving precision. Could it be that I had stumbled into something far more sinister than a series of coincidences? Every attempt to find a rational explanation only deepened the mystery. I gathered every scrap of evidence I could, audio clips, photographs, and detailed journal entries. But the more I collected, the more I realized that logic was slipping away. One night, as the clock neared 3 a.m., I awoke to the sound of my apartment door creaking open on its own. Frozen in bed, I watched as a pale, almost translucent figure drifted into the room. Its eyes shone with an otherworldly light, and before I could react, it vanished as if swallowed by the darkness. Now, as I pack my belongings and prepare to leave this place behind, I am haunted by the possibility that what I experienced was not merely a series of coincidences or the quirks of an old building. The evidence is as inexplicable as it is undeniable, and every rational explanation I consider crumbles under the weight of the unknown. I have shared my recordings and photos online, only to be met with dismissive skepticism or, disturbingly, a quiet affirmation from others who claim to have experienced similar events. As I close this chapter of my life, I cannot shake the thought that I may have unwittingly tapped into something ancient and malevolent, a presence that exists in the interstices of our everyday reality. Was I merely a victim of my own overactive imagination, or did I truly awaken forces beyond our understanding? The questions remain unanswered, echoing in my mind like a refrain I cannot escape. I leave behind the apartment on Elm Street with a lingering sense of dread, uncertain whether the hidden room, the whispered voices, and that pale, watching figure were all part of an elaborate, inexplicable narrative that is far bigger and scarier than I ever dared imagine. I never used to question the fabric of reality, but lately, doubt has crept in like a persistent shadow. It began innocuously enough. A misplaced pen, a door left ajar, the quiet hum of the refrigerator at an unusual hour. I chalked these events up to absent-mindedness and the weariness of long days. But as time passed, the occurrences multiplied in both frequency and strangeness. Every day, small oddities accumulated. A book rearranged on my shelf, a familiar face in a crowd of strangers, a whisper that seemed to echo with a memory not my own. I dismissed these as coincidences or tricks of a tired mind, yet an unsettling feeling gnawed at me beneath the veneer of normalcy. At first, the anomalies were benign. I would return home from work and find my keys not on the hook where I always left them, but in a different drawer altogether. A neighbor, whom I had never spoken to despite living in the same building for years, smiled at me in the hallway as if we shared an intimate secret. These moments were fleeting, almost charming in their peculiarity. I began to document them with a detached curiosity, hoping to uncover a rational explanation. But as dusk turned to night, the incidents took on a darker hue. One chilly evening, while sitting in my dimly lit living room, I heard the soft sound of someone humming, a tune I recognized from my childhood, emanating from the empty corridor outside my apartment. I paused, straining to catch the melody as it wavered between clarity and distortion, like a ghostly echo from a forgotten past. When I stepped into the hallway, there was nothing but the oppressive silence and the lingering sense that I was not alone. I questioned my senses, attributing the sound to fatigue or an overactive imagination, yet a seed of unease had already taken root. As the weeks wore on, the disturbances grew more disconcerting. Objects began to vanish, only to reappear in places that defied logic. A cherished mug discovered on the windowsill bathed in morning light, a scarf mysteriously placed atop a stack of old magazines. I started noticing people who seemed inexplicably familiar, faces that sparked recognition yet belonged to strangers, their eyes reflecting a depth of emotion I could not place. Their fleeting glances and silent acknowledgments left me wondering if I was caught in a subtle interplay between memory and the present. Late one night, in the dead of a stormy evening, I awoke to a gentle tapping at my window. With trembling hands, I drew aside the curtain to see a lone figure standing under the harsh glare of a street lamp, rain streaming down its indistinct features. The figure lingered for a long, agonizing moment before dissolving into the darkness, leaving me questioning whether it had been a passerby or a figment of my deteriorating perception. I reported the incident to friends, but their reassurances that I was simply sleep-deprived did little to calm the growing terror within. Desperate for clarity, I set up a small camera in my living room to record any anomalies during the night. The footage yielded nothing more than occasional static and fleeting shadows, which only served to deepen the mystery. I began keeping a meticulous journal, documenting every unusual occurrence in the hope of piecing together a coherent explanation. Yet, each entry only seemed to raise more questions. The voices I recorded whispered fragments of conversations in a language half-remembered, and the images caught on film defied any logical interpretation. Now, as I sit in the dim glow of a solitary lamp, the line between what is real and what is imagined has become perilously blurred. Every creak in the floorboards and every subtle shift in the air fills me with dread, as if an unseen presence watches from the periphery of my vision. I have tried to share my experiences with those I trust, but they dismiss my accounts as the ramblings of a stressed mind, unable to see the truth that lies hidden in plain sight. The more I try to convince them, the more isolated I feel, trapped in a reality that no longer seems entirely my own. Tonight, as a relentless tapping resounds outside my window, and the wind howls like a chorus of lost souls, I am left to wonder if these events are the product of a mind unraveling under pressure, or if I have inadvertently stepped into a realm where the ordinary gives way to the extraordinary. Every unanswered question intensifies my fear, leaving me suspended in a state of perpetual uncertainty. I am haunted by the possibility that I am not merely losing my grip on reality, but that I have glimpsed a hidden truth lurking just beyond the edges of perception, a truth that challenges everything I once believed to be certain. I remain here, caught between doubt and conviction, unable to discern whether the strange occurrences are the machinations of my overactive imagination or the subtle manifestations of something far more enigmatic. The unanswered questions echo in the silence of my mind, each one a reminder that the line between reality and illusion is as fragile as a whisper in the dark. And so, as I write these final words, I am left with a haunting uncertainty. Is there a world beyond what I can perceive, or have I simply become lost in a maze of my own making? Every tick of the clock now resonates with the sound of unanswered mysteries, and I am left questioning whether my experiences are merely the echoes of a restless mind or a glimpse into an unfathomable reality that defies all reason. I used to work the late shift at a 24-hour diner in a quiet town that barely had any nightlife. The kind of place where regulars nurse coffee for hours and truckers stop for quick meals before hitting the road again. It was a routine job, mostly wiping down counters, refilling cups, and pretending not to listen to the town gossip. I never thought much about it until one particular night, when something happened that still sends a chill down my spine. It was just past 2 a.m., and the diner was nearly empty. The only customers were a grizzled trucker near the window, a young woman scrolling through her phone, and a man sitting at the counter, his face hidden by the brim of a baseball cap. He hadn't ordered anything yet, just sat there, staring at his hands. Something about him made me uneasy, but I brushed it off as exhaustion playing tricks on me. Eventually, I went over and asked if he wanted coffee. He slowly lifted his head, and I swear, I've never seen eyes so empty before. They weren't just tired or glazed over. They were void of anything. No light, no emotion, just this vacant stare that seemed to look straight through me. He nodded without a word, so I poured him a cup and went back to cleaning. That's when the little things started happening. The young woman at the corner booth suddenly got up and left without finishing her drink, her face pale like she'd just seen something awful. The trucker followed a few minutes later, dropping a 20 on the table and mumbling something about getting back on the road. That left just me and the man at the counter. He hadn't touched his coffee. He just sat there, fingers lightly tapping the rim of the cup, staring straight ahead. I try not to let it get to me, but there was something off. The air in the diner felt different, heavier somehow, like the walls were closing in. I cleared my throat, trying to shake the feeling. "You all right, man?" I asked. He didn't respond. I stood there for a second, debating whether to leave him alone, when he finally spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Do you ever feel like something's watching you?" I froze. The way he said it, so calm, so matter-of-fact, sent a shiver through me. "A what?" I forced a chuckle, trying to keep things light. "Like paranoia or something?" His fingers stopped tapping the cup. He turned his head slightly, just enough to face me, but not enough to make it feel like a normal conversation. "No," he said, like something that's always been there, waiting. I didn't know how to respond to that. A part of me wanted to ask what he meant, but another part, the smarter part, told me not to. Instead, I busied myself with wiping down the counter, hoping he'd drop whatever weird mood he was in. The clock ticked on, and he still didn't drink his coffee. He just sat there, unmoving. At some point, I had to step into the back to grab some supplies. I was only gone for maybe 30 seconds, but when I returned, he was gone. The stool where he'd sat was empty. That should have been the end of it. But as I turned to the register, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. His coffee cup, it was still full, but the rim was covered in deep, dark scratches. Not like someone had scraped it with a spoon or their fingernail. These were deep, jagged marks, as if something had been clawing at the porcelain. I stood there staring at it, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. My gut told me to toss the cup, to pretend I hadn't noticed anything, but my hands wouldn't move. Then, as I stood frozen, the air around me shifted. I swear I felt something brush past me, like a shadow that wasn't supposed to be there. I locked up early that night. When my manager asked why, I told him I wasn't feeling well, which wasn't a complete lie. But I didn't mention the man, or the coffee cup, or the feeling that something had followed me home that night. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. My apartment felt different, like I was never truly alone. The lights would flicker at odd times, and my reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed just a little delayed, like it took a second too long to move when I did. And sometimes, late at night, I'd hear soft tapping outside my window, steady, rhythmic, like fingers drumming against glass. I tried telling myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But then about a month later, I was closing up the diner again when I saw him. Or at least I think I did. He was standing just outside the glow of the streetlights, the brim of his baseball cap tilted down, his hands resting at his sides. I couldn't see his face, but I knew it was him. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, waiting. I locked the door and went straight home. I haven't seen him since, but I still feel him sometimes, like a weight pressing against the edges of my reality. I don't know who he was or what he was, but I do know one thing. Something was watching that night in the diner. And whatever it was, it hasn't stopped. I moved into the apartment on a rainy November day, thinking that a change of scenery would help me put the past behind me. The building was old but well kept, with a familiar layout that promised stability. On the first day, everything seemed perfectly normal. The walls were painted a soft beige, the hallway lit by a row of flickering fluorescent lights, and the door to my unit hung exactly as I'd seen it in the listing. I spent that evening arranging my few belongings and settling in, feeling hopeful for the first time in a long while. A week later, I began noticing little things that didn't add up. One morning, I reached into the cabinet for my favorite mug, the one with a faded blue rim, and found it missing. I distinctly remembered placing it on the counter last night. I searched the apartment from room to room, even checked under the sofa and behind the curtains, but it was nowhere to be found. I mentioned it offhand to my neighbor, Mrs. Langley, a kindly older woman who always greeted me with a smile, but she only shrugged and said, "Strange, I haven't seen it." I chalked it up to misplacement. Perhaps I'd simply forgotten where I put it. But the disappearances grew more unsettling. Over the next few days, I began finding items in places I was sure I hadn't left them. My keys, which I always set down on the narrow table near the door, turned up on the kitchen counter. A paperback novel I'd finished reading one evening was discovered later that morning, neatly placed on my bedside table, even though I remembered putting it back in my bag. At first, I wondered if I was simply being forgetful. Yet, each incident carried a disquieting precision that made it hard to dismiss as mere absent-mindedness. Then came the changes in the apartment itself. I'd grown accustomed to the layout. The living room, with its neatly arranged sofa and a small coffee table by the window, felt like a constant amidst the chaos of my inner life. One afternoon, after returning from work, I entered my apartment and froze. The sofa, which I had left facing the window, now sat angled toward the door. The coffee table had been moved a few inches to the left, and the cushion on the armchair was replaced with one I didn't own. I called my landlord, who insisted that no one had been in the unit, and when I pointed out the discrepancies, he simply frowned and assured me the building was secure. But I couldn't shake the feeling that my surroundings were rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking. I began to notice even subtler changes in the behavior of the people around me. At the grocery store, I struck up a conversation with a fellow shopper who claimed we'd met before at a community event, even though I was sure I'd never seen her in my life. At work, a coworker remarked on how changed I seemed lately, as if I'd become someone entirely different overnight. Their words didn't match the memories I had of our previous interactions. I tried mentioning these oddities to friends and colleagues, but every time I brought it up, they dismissed it as a misremembering of trivial details, urging me to relax and not overthink. The strangest instance occurred one crisp evening when I returned home to find a series of small, unfamiliar marks along the hallway wall, faint scratches that ran in a neat, almost deliberate pattern. I remember the wall as smooth and unblemished, yet these marks appeared as if someone had etched them there, only to vanish moments later when I blinked and looked again. I questioned my own senses, wondering if I was losing my mind, but the evidence was tangible. I took pictures and even tried to trace the lines with my fingers, but they felt as if they were impressions in an altered reality. Each time I returned to the apartment, I hoped to find that the changes were just my imagination. The next day, however, the layout was subtly different again. The position of the sofa had shifted back to its original spot, or so I thought, but the arrangement of the cushions was now reversed. The bookshelf that I always remembered as being on the left side of the living room was now on the right. I could swear I had seen the painting above the mantel change its subject slightly. One moment it depicted a serene landscape, the next a stormy, turbulent sky. I started to document every detail, writing down times and taking photos, but the images on my phone confirmed nothing was amiss. To everyone else, my apartment looked unchanged, a static snapshot of normalcy. Desperation and anxiety began to consume me. I felt like I was trapped in a world that only I could see shifting, like a secret language of change that the rest of the world was blind to. Each night, I would lie awake, replaying the day's events and questioning my memory. Were these changes random coincidences, or was something or someone behind them? The feeling of being watched crept in, not by an intruder, but by the apartment itself, by the very fabric of the reality I thought I knew. One particularly long, sleepless night, I mustered the courage to confront the emptiness. I sat in the darkened living room, eyes fixed on the familiar, yet now alien furniture. The room, once a haven, felt hostile in its inconsistency. A realization began to crystallize. Perhaps I wasn't the only variable. Maybe my world, the everyday scenes and the people I trusted, were part of a closed loop, an elaborate simulation where nothing was fixed and everything could change without warning. I wondered if I was living in a version of reality that was selectively mutable, where the rules I believed in were nothing more than illusions. Now, as I type these words in the dim light of an early morning, I'm left with a lingering, oppressive question. Is anyone else really experiencing these changes? Or am I alone in a world that has shifted into something unrecognizable? Every time I step outside, I see the same streets, the same familiar faces. Yet there's a nagging sense that behind the veneer of normalcy lies an alternate, shifting reality that refuses to be static. My mind is plagued by the thought that I'm trapped in a cycle, a closed loop where my reality is continually rewritten, while everyone else remains blissfully unaware. And as I sit here, heart pounding and eyes darting at every shadow, I can't help but feel that I've become an unwilling participant in something far more sinister than a simple series of coincidences, a place where the world is real to everyone else. Yet to me, it has become completely alien and hostile. I always thought I knew myself, that my thoughts and actions were mine alone. That was before the day I realized something was terribly off. It began with small lapses, a few missing minutes here and there that I initially dismissed as distractions. I'd come home from work one evening, and while I distinctly remembered locking the door before leaving, I later discovered it ajar, as if someone had slipped in and out unnoticed. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness. But over time, the anomalies grew, and soon it wasn't just the door. It was me. It started subtly. I began noticing that conversations with friends or co-workers felt disjointed. They'd mentioned things I was sure I hadn't said. A colleague recounted a heated debate we'd supposedly had about a project, one that I had no recollection of initiating. At first, I assumed my memory was simply playing tricks on me due to stress. Then, on a day that seemed perfectly ordinary, I caught a glimpse of myself in a mirror. For just a moment, my reflection didn't match my movements. I blinked hard, and the image aligned again, but the unnerving sensation of being an imposter in my own body lingered long after. My sense of time began to betray me too. I'd lose hours without any explanation. One morning, I woke up in my apartment to find the clock showing 8 a.m., even though I distinctly remembered falling asleep at midnight. When I tried to piece together what I had done during those missing hours, my mind was a blur. I started documenting my day, keeping a meticulous journal, and even recording short video clips on my phone. But when I reviewed them, certain details were inexplicably different. Background objects subtly shifted, my own words sometimes altered in tone and inflection. It was as if I were living in two different timelines simultaneously, one that everyone else experienced as normal, and another that I was only beginning to perceive. Then came the feeling that something was controlling me from the inside. I'd catch myself pausing mid-sentence, feeling as though I were no longer in full control of my own actions. Once, while driving home, I suddenly took a turn I don't remember planning. When a passenger in the car later remarked how I seemed to be on autopilot, my heart pounded in my chest. It wasn't just a random misstep. It was as if an unseen force was rewriting my decisions in real time. My body moved and reacted, but my mind wasn't always there to command it. I began to question if I was the one making the choices or if something else was pulling the strings. At work, the changes became even more disturbing. I started receiving emails and messages that appeared to be from me. Messages I had no recollection of sending, containing thoughts and opinions that weren't mine at all. My coworkers began to comment on my odd behavior, saying things like, "You're different today," or "I swear you weren't like this yesterday." I would laugh it off, blaming a bad mood or exhaustion. But deep down I knew something was fundamentally wrong. My actions, my words, even the very memories I clung to seemed to shift, as if edited by an external hand. One particularly harrowing night, I awoke to find myself standing in the middle of my living room, unable to remember how I had gotten there. The room was silent, the familiar surroundings unchanged except for the unsettling stillness that hung in the air. As I tried to piece together the fragments of my thoughts, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper echoed in my mind. It was not a voice I recognized, yet it felt intimately personal, as if it belonged to a part of me I had never known. I felt an icy certainty that I was no longer alone within my own skin, that something had invaded, guiding me, controlling the narrative of my life. Desperation set in. I reached out to therapists and even spiritual counselors, desperate for an explanation. Each time, I was met with gentle reassurances that I was under stress, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the evidence was undeniable. My journal, once filled with clear recollections of mundane events, now contained entries that contradicted one another. Photos and recordings from my phone revealed subtle differences from one day to the next, differences I could feel, but not quite articulate. It was as if my life had become a series of snapshots in an ever-changing slideshow, one where the transitions were controlled by a force I couldn't name. I tried to assert control, to fight back against this invisible puppeteer, but every attempt only deepened the void of uncertainty. Even when I consciously planned my day, I found myself drifting into periods where time seemed to evaporate, leaving behind gaps that no one but I was aware of. I began to feel trapped in a body that wasn't entirely my own, a mind that wasn't fully mine either. The sensation of being watched, of being observed from within, became a constant companion, an oppressive presence that I couldn't escape. Now, as I sit here in the dim light of my apartment, I stare at the reflection in the window and wonder if it truly is me or a version of myself that has been altered by forces beyond comprehension. The walls seem to close in, and every quiet moment is filled with the echo of that disembodied whisper, reminding me that I am not entirely in control. I have no answers, only a growing dread that my reality has been hijacked. I am left to wonder if I will ever reclaim the autonomy I once had, or if I am destined to live in a perpetual state of internal surveillance, where every thought, every action, is dictated by something lurking in the shadows of my mind. And so I write this account, not in search of sympathy or solutions, but as a warning to those who might one day find themselves questioning the true nature of their own existence. because sometimes the scariest danger isn't out there, but inside, where you can never quite tell if you're still the one in control. I moved into the apartment on a rainy November day, eager for a fresh start in a place that promised stability and comfort. The building was old but charming, with creaking floors that whispered history and narrow hallways lined with faded portraits. On my first day, everything seemed perfectly normal. The familiar layout, the reliable hum of the boiler, even the doorman's friendly nod as he passed by. I spent that first evening arranging my few belongings, feeling a tentative optimism for the future. A week later, subtle anomalies began to appear. I reached into the cupboard for my favorite mug, a ceramic piece with a delicate blue rim, and found it missing from its usual spot on the counter. I searched every corner of the apartment, but it was nowhere to be found. I mentioned it offhand to Mrs. Carter, the neighbor from across the hall, but she merely smiled and said, "Maybe you moved it without realizing." I tried to brush it off as an innocent oversight. Yet over the next few days, other small things started to vanish or reappear in unexpected places. My keys, always kept in a small bowl near the door, would sometimes be found on the kitchen table. A paperback novel I was reading ended up neatly stacked on my bedside table, even though I was sure I had left it in my bag. At first, I assumed these were simple slips of memory, stress-induced misplacements. But then the changes became more disconcerting. One evening, as I returned home late from work, I opened the door to find the living room slightly rearranged. The sofa, which I had always left facing the window, now pointed toward the entrance. The coffee table, once adorned with a few carefully chosen books and a small vase, had been shifted a few inches to the left, and the lamp that used to cast a soft glow was now angled oddly, creating strange, elongated shadows on the wall. My heart pounded as I retraced my steps in the apartment, trying desperately to remember if I had moved anything, but nothing seemed to add up. Then came the night that shattered my sense of normalcy. I was lying in bed when I heard a faint sound, like the soft scraping of a fingernail along wood, coming from the hallway. I crept out, half expecting an intruder, but the corridor was empty and silent, illuminated only by the dim glow of the overhead light. Yet, as I passed by the communal staircase, I noticed a new mark on the wall, a series of shallow scratches arranged in a pattern that was both deliberate and disturbing. I couldn't recall ever seeing anything like it before, and when I mentioned it to the building manager the next morning, he insisted the wall was pristine, as it had been for years. The people around me began to change, too. At the local grocery store, the cashier who used to chat warmly with regulars now offered only curt nods and blank smiles. Mrs. Carter, usually a kind and talkative neighbor, would pass me in the hall with her eyes lowered, as if she were avoiding my gaze. At work, my colleagues, once friendly and familiar, started to behave in ways that felt almost alien. During a casual conversation, one coworker recounted a story that I distinctly remembered never having heard, and another complimented me on a habit I was sure I had never developed. I tried to mention these discrepancies to friends, but they dismissed my concerns as overactive imagination or stress. As the days turned into weeks, the anomalies grew bolder. One evening, while I sat alone in my living room reading, I noticed a series of faint, almost imperceptible inscriptions along the baseboard. The marks, as if etched by a careful hand, read, "Nothing is as it seems." I felt a chill course through me, and my pulse raced with the sudden awareness that these weren't random scratches. They were messages, deliberate and inexplicable. I took pictures and tried to compare them with previous nights, but every time I checked, the inscriptions had either vanished or shifted, leaving behind an unsettling emptiness. I began to document everything in a journal, writing down every small change, every odd occurrence. Each entry only deepened my anxiety. The more I recorded, the more I realized that my memories of everyday events were beginning to blur. I could swear that conversations I had with friends the previous day had been different, altered in tone, details subtly rearranged. Yet when I asked, no one recalled any change. It was as if my recollections were being rewritten, like a script edited while I wasn't looking. One night, after a particularly long and restless day, I sat in the darkened kitchen watching the clock. The minutes ticked by in an almost oppressive silence when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My reflection in the window wasn't quite right. For a split second, I saw behind me a figure standing in the dim hallway, a figure that I was sure hadn't been there when I'd gone to bed. I spun around, heart hammering, but the corridor was empty. Still, that image haunted me, a ghostly reminder that my world was shifting in ways I couldn't comprehend. I eventually reached a breaking point. Desperate for answers, I approached Mrs. Carter again, asking if she'd noticed anything unusual in the building lately. She gave me a fleeting look, a mixture of pity and fear, before quickly changing the subject. "You must be imagining things, dear," she said softly. "The building is as it always has been." But her eyes told a different story, a story of secrets kept and truths unspoken. Now, as I write this in the quiet hours of the night, I feel an overwhelming sense of isolation. The world outside appears normal, the streets busy and predictable, yet inside, everything has taken on a sinister, ever-shifting quality. I no longer trust my senses. Each time I step through my door, I'm greeted by subtle changes. Furniture in unfamiliar positions, messages I never left, the lingering impression that something is watching, waiting. I can't shake the feeling that I'm caught in a closed loop, trapped in a reality where every ordinary moment conceals a darker, inexplicable truth. I'm left with the haunting realization that these events aren't mere coincidences or tricks of my mind. They are part of something much larger, something deliberately orchestrated that I can neither understand nor escape. Whether it's a sinister force at work or a secret experiment hidden in plain sight, I now live with the constant terror that my world is not as it seems. Every ordinary encounter carries a weight of uncertainty. Every familiar face hides an unfathomable secret, and every change, no matter how small, cements the truth that I have stumbled into something far more dangerous than I ever imagined. I don't have answers, and perhaps I never will, but one thing is clear. I'm trapped in a reality that has become as alien as it is hostile, and I fear there may be no way out.